Aboard a Japanese aircraft carrier slicing through the dark Pacific swells one restless night in 1944, a young pilot named Hiroshi stood alone near the edge of the flight deck, his fingers tracing the faded edges of a small photograph he kept tucked inside his flight jacket. The wind tugged at his uniform, carrying the salt and the endless motion of the sea, and for a moment he allowed himself to imagine the tiny room back in his village where his wife and their infant daughter slept. He wondered if the baby would recognize the sound of his voice if he ever made it home again. Hiroshi had not always been a carrier pilot. Like so many others in the Imperial Navy's air groups by this stage of the war, he had been rushed through training after the terrible losses of experienced men in earlier campaigns. The instructors had done their best, but there were simply not enough hours in the day or enough fuel for the kind of practice that turned boys into masters of the sky. Hiroshi had seen friends die during simple landing drills, their planes cartwheeling into the sea because their hands were still learning what veteran pilots once did by instinct. Yet when the orders came for this next operation, he had saluted and climbed into his cockpit without hesitation. Duty was not something a man questioned out loud, even when fear sat heavy in his chest during the quiet watches of the night. He had written a letter to his wife the evening before, folding it carefully inside a waterproof pouch he'd planned to leave with a trusted friend if the worst came. In the letter he had tried to sound steady. He described the endless horizon, the way the sun rose over the water in colors that took his breath away, and how the other pilots still found reasons to laugh during meals. He did not write about the whispered conversations in the ready room, the talk of how few of them were likely to return from what the high command was calling the decisive battle. He did not mention the way his hands sometimes trembled when he strapped on his parachute, or how he had begun to dream of his daughter's face whenever exhaustion finally pulled him into sleep. The sea had a way of making everything feel both vast and terribly small at the same time. Hiroshi often thought about how the same ocean that carried his ship also carried the American fleet somewhere out there in the darkness. He had never seen an American up close, yet he had heard stories from the veterans who remained. The Americans, they said, were learning fast. Their planes were getting better, their pilots more confident, and their ships seemed to appear in numbers that defied belief. Hiroshi's own aircraft was older, its engine tired, its guns sometimes jamming at the worst moments during practice. Still, he told himself that courage and the right moment could make up for many shortcomings. That was what the senior officers kept repeating during briefings. One great victory, they said, could change everything. It could force the Americans to reconsider their advance and give Japan breathing room to rebuild its strength. What Hiroshi did not say to anyone was that the thought of that victory also frightened him. He had seen what happened when brave men flew into impossible fights. He had watched burning planes spiral down and had heard the final radio calls that ended in static. Part of him wondered whether the high command truly understood how thin their ranks had become, or whether the plan for this coming clash had been shaped more by hope than by a clear picture of what remained. Thousands of miles away, on the deck of an American carrier also moving steadily westward, a young man named Tom from a small town in Kansas leaned against the railing and reread a letter from his mother for what must have been the 20th time. The paper was soft from handling, the words already familiar, yet he found comfort in the ordinary details she shared, the neighbor's new calf, the way the corn was coming in despite the dry spell, the church social that had raised money for the war effort. Tom had joined the Navy right after high school, partly because he wanted to see something beyond the flat fields of home and partly because he believed the fight against aggression was worth joining. Now, after months at sea and after watching friends disappear during earlier operations, he sometimes wondered whether he had been naive. Tom flew a Hellcat, and he was good at it. His squadron mates respected the way he stayed calm even when tracers filled the sky. What they did not see were the nights he lay awake in his bunk, listening to the steady thrum of the ship's engines and thinking about the girl he had left behind. He had promised her he would come home and finish the house they had started planning. He kept her photograph in the same pocket as his dog tags, and sometimes during long patrols he would touch the outline of it through the fabric, a small private gesture that steadied him. The men around Tom had their own private anchors. One gunner carried a Bible his grandmother had given him, its pages marked with notes in her careful handwriting. Another pilot kept a small wooden carving his little brother had made, the edges worn smooth from being turned over and over in his hands during tense moments. These small things mattered more than anyone outside the ship might have guessed. In the middle of an ocean that could swallow a man without a trace, these tokens became proof that another world still existed, a world where people waited and prayed and tried to live normal lives. The American fleet Tom sailed with was the largest anyone had ever seen gathered in one place. It carried the hopes of a nation that had already poured so much into the Pacific campaign. Tom and his friends understood that the next objective, the island of Saipan, was not just another speck on the map. Taking it would give their country airfields close enough for the big new bombers to reach Japan itself. That knowledge sat differently with each man. For some it meant the war might finally be brought to the enemy's doorstep and perhaps ended sooner. For others it meant the fighting was about to become even more desperate, because no nation gives up its inner defenses without a brutal struggle. Tom had listened to older sailors talk about earlier landings. He had heard the stories of men pinned on narrow beaches, of ships burning offshore, of the terrible arithmetic that sometimes decided who lived and who did not. He did not pretend to be fearless. He had learned that courage often looked like doing what needed to be done even when your stomach was tight and your mouth was dry. During the long days at sea he kept busy with maintenance on his plane, with card games that grew loud and then quiet again, with the simple act of checking on the newer pilots who still jumped at every unexpected sound. These small kindnesses were how men held one another together when the waiting stretched on. On both sides of the coming clash, the same ocean carried men who carried letters and photographs and private hopes. The Japanese High Command had decided that the defense of the Marianas would be the place for the great battle they had long sought. They believed that by drawing the American fleet close to islands defended by land-based aircraft, and by using their own carriers to strike at the right moment, they could inflict a blow so severe that the Americans would be forced to pause or even negotiate. It was a gamble born of necessity. Japan's industrial strength could no longer match the flood of American ships and planes. The experienced pilots who had once dominated the skies were mostly gone, replaced by young men like Hiroshi who flew with determination but without the years of hard-won skill that once made Japanese naval aviation legendary. The Americans, for their part, had learned hard lessons of their own. They had suffered stinging defeats early in the war and had paid in blood for every island gained since. Yet their shipyards were producing carriers and planes at a rate that seemed impossible to the enemy. Their pilots were growing steadily more experienced, their radar and fighter direction systems more effective, and their commanders more confident in the vast spaces of the Pacific. The men on the American ships did not know the exact details of the Japanese plan, but they sensed that something large was approaching. The tension showed in the way officers studied charts a little longer than usual, in the extra checks on aircraft and weapons, and the quiet conversations that stopped when a newcomer approached. Hiroshi and Tom never met, never even knew the other existed, yet their lives were already connected by the same stretch of water and the same approaching storm. Both had left behind people who loved them. Both had chosen, or accepted, the path that placed them in harm's way. Both carried the ordinary courage of young men who still believed the future could be shaped by what they did in the next few days. In the quiet moments between drills and watches, each sometimes allowed himself to imagine what peace might look like. For Hiroshi it was the sound of his daughter's laughter in a garden. For Tom it was the sound of a hammer on the house he hoped to finish, the girl he loved standing in the doorway calling him in for supper. The Pacific had already taken so much from both nations. It had swallowed ships and planes and thousands of lives at places whose names still carried weight in the hearts of survivors. Yet the war had not ended, and the leaders on both sides believed the next clash would decide whether the fighting continued for years more or whether one side could force a turning point. The men who would actually do the fighting, the ones who would climb into cockpits and man the guns and write the last letters, carried no such certainty. They carried only their training, their comrades, their small personal talismans, and the stubborn human instinct to keep going even when the odds felt overwhelming. As the Japanese carriers continued their careful approach and the enormous American armada protected the invasion force heading for Saipan, the distance between the two fleets slowly shrank. Lookouts scanned empty horizons that would soon fill with danger. Radar operators practiced their routines, knowing that soon those glowing blips would represent real aircraft flown by real men. In ready rooms and on mess decks, conversations turned more often to home, to the things worth fighting for, to the hope that whatever came next would be over quickly. No one spoke much about the possibility that it might not be quick at all. There is something profoundly moving about ordinary people caught in the gears of history. Hiroshi folding his letter one last time. Tom checking the straps on his parachute harness and thinking of the girl waiting back home. The Japanese sailor who quietly gave his extra rice ration to a younger shipmate who had been too seasick to eat. The American chaplain who sat with a homesick gunner and simply listened without trying to offer easy answers. These moments did not change the course of nations, yet they were the threads that held men together when everything around them threatened to unravel. They remind us that even in the largest battles, it is still individuals who feel the fear, who show the kindness, who carry the photographs and the letters and the quiet resolve that history so often forgets to record. If these stories of young men standing on the edge of something immense have stayed with you, you may find yourself wanting to see the spirit of the Pacific War brought to life in a way that honors the courage and the cost. There is a powerful film called Midway that captures the heart of carrier battles in those waters with respect and intensity, and it is available to stream right now on Prime Video. Or if you prefer to hold a tangible connection to that era, our trusted partners on Amazon offer some truly remarkable WW2 memorabilia, replicas and pieces that let you touch a small fragment of the history these men lived. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The fleets kept moving. The letters stayed folded. The photographs remained close to beating hearts. And somewhere ahead, beyond the curve of the horizon, the gathering storm was about to break. In the quiet of his cabin aboard the heavy cruiser Indianapolis, Admiral Raymond Spruance stood at a small desk and ran his fingers along the edge of a single photograph he kept there. A picture of his wife and children taken years earlier before the war had pulled him so far from home. The map spread before him showed the vast stretches of the Pacific, but in his mind the lines and symbols were not abstract. There were the lives of young men he had never met, men who would soon fly from the decks of carriers under his command or storm beaches on islands whose names most Americans could barely pronounce. The responsibility pressed down on him with a weight that no uniform could hide. Spruance had always been a man who carried his thoughts inward. Even in moments of victory, he rarely raised his voice or sought the spotlight. He had learned early in his career that the sea rewarded patience and punished rashness, and the lessons had shaped him into a commander who thought several moves ahead, like a chess player who understood that sacrificing a piece too early could lose the entire game. Yet the victories he had already helped deliver had not made the burden lighter. If anything, they had made it heavier, because now more people looked to him for answers, and the stakes had grown larger with every mile the American forces advanced toward Japan's inner defenses. He thought often of the young pilots and sailors who would bear the immediate cost of whatever decisions he made in the coming days. Spruance knew that many of them were barely out of their teens, boys who had left farms and small towns with dreams that had nothing to do with dying far from home. He had seen the letters they wrote, the way they tried to sound brave for the families waiting back in places like Iowa or Texas or California. The knowledge that his orders could determine whether those letters reached their destinations or became the last words their loved ones would ever receive sat with him constantly. It was not a weight he discussed openly. Instead, he carried it in the careful way he listened to his staff, in the long silences while he studied reports, in the quiet habit of walking the decks of his flagship at odd hours just to be among the men whose lives he held in his hands. Nearby, on the carrier Lexington, Admiral Mark Mitcher moved through the flag plot with the same restless energy that had defined his entire career in naval aviation. Mitcher was not a man who lingered in one place for long. He had come up through the early, dangerous days of flying from ships, when aircraft were fragile and the sea unforgiving. He had earned a reputation for being tough, sometimes gruff, the kind of commander who expected excellence and did not soften his words when standards slipped. Yet those who served closest to him knew that the toughness was only the outer layer. Beneath it lived a fierce loyalty to the young airmen who climbed into cockpits every day and trusted that someone on the ship cared whether they came back. Mitcher had seen too many good pilots lost to accidents, to enemy fire, to the simple exhaustion of flying long missions over empty ocean. He carried those losses personally, even when the official reports listed them as numbers. In quiet moments he would sometimes stand near the ready rooms and listen to the banter of the younger aviators, the nervous jokes that masked fear, the way they spoke of home in half sentences as if saying too much might tempt fate. Mitcher understood that kind of fear because he had felt it himself decades earlier. It was one reason he pushed his staff hard on training and maintenance, why he insisted on giving his squadrons every possible advantage before they launched. He could not remove the danger, but he could refuse to send men into it unprepared. There was a private side to Mitcher that few outside his inner circle ever saw. He had a habit of remembering small details about the men under his command, the names of their wives or the towns they came from, details that surfaced at unexpected moments during briefings or when he visited the hangar decks. These were not gestures for show. They were his way of reminding himself, and them, that behind every plane and every gun there was still a human being with people waiting for him. In a war that could turn men into statistics, Mitcher fought quietly against that erasure. He knew the coming battle would test that resolve more severely than anything he had faced before. Far across the same ocean, aboard the Japanese carrier Taiho, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa carried a different kind of weight. Ozawa was a man of stern bearing and deep sense of duty, the kind of officer who had risen through a navy that valued discipline and sacrifice above almost everything else. He had watched his country's fortunes shift over the years of fighting, had seen the early string of victories give way to grinding attrition as American industrial power and determination began to tell. Now he commanded what remained of Japan's carrier striking force, and he understood better than most how thin that force had become. Ozawa knew the quality of the pilots under his command had declined sharply. The veterans who had once made Japanese naval aviation the terror of the Pacific were largely gone, replaced by young men rushed through abbreviated training. Many could take off and land, but few possessed the instinctive skill that had once allowed Japanese airmen to dominate dogfights. Ozawa had argued, quietly and persistently, for more time to rebuild that experience, but the demands of the war and the expectations of higher command had left little room for patience. The plan he now carried was born of that reality, a desperate attempt to use what remained of Japan's naval air power in one coordinated strike that might yet change the course of the conflict. In his cabin, Ozawa sometimes sat alone with reports that detailed shortages of fuel, of aircraft parts, of trained mechanics. He read them carefully, absorbing the numbers not as abstractions but as the difference between a pilot returning safely or vanishing into the sea. He thought of his own family back in Japan, of the wife who wrote letters that tried to sound hopeful even as the news from the fronts grew darker. Ozawa did not allow himself the luxury of despair in front of his staff, yet the burden of knowing that many of the young men he would order into the air might not return weighed on him constantly. He carried it with the same rigid posture he maintained on the bridge, the same measured tone he used when speaking to subordinates. Duty, for Ozawa, was not a matter of feeling but of continuing to do what honor required even when the path ahead looked increasingly narrow. The three admirals had never met and would never meet, yet their decisions were already shaping one another's futures across the empty miles of ocean. Spruance carried the responsibility of protecting the invasion force heading for Saipan while deciding how aggressively to use his carriers. Mitcher carried the practical burden of turning that strategy into air operations that would keep his pilots alive while striking hard at the enemy. Ozawa carried the grim knowledge that his side was outmatched in almost every measurable way and that only extraordinary execution, or extraordinary luck, could offset the disadvantages his men faced. What united them was the simple, terrible truth that leadership in wartime meant sending other men's sons into danger while remaining behind to bear the consequences of every choice. Spruance had learned after earlier successes that victory did not erase the faces of those who did not come home. Mitcher had watched too many of his aviators disappear over the horizon and had begun to understand that every plane launched carried a piece of his own conscience with it. Ozawa had inherited a force already thinned by years of fighting and knew that no amount of personal courage could fully compensate for the experience that had been lost. In the days leading up to the clash, each man moved through his routines with the outward calm expected of high command. Spruance reviewed reports from his subordinates and asked quiet questions that revealed how deeply he had considered every possibility. Mitcher spent time among the air groups, his presence both reassuring and demanding, the kind of leadership that made tired pilots stand a little straighter. Ozawa inspected his ships and spoke with his staff about coordination with land-based aircraft, his words measured even when the news he received was discouraging. Beneath these visible actions ran the private currents of doubt, resolve, and the constant awareness that thousands of lives hung on the clarity of their thinking. There were small moments that revealed the human cost of that awareness. Spruance once paused during a briefing to ask about a junior officer he remembered from an earlier operation, a young man who had not returned. The question was brief, almost casual, yet those present understood it carried more weight than any formal inquiry. Mitcher, after a long day of planning strikes, sometimes walked alone along the flight deck at night, the wind pulling at his jacket while he thought about the boys who would soon launch from that same deck into whatever waited beyond the horizon. Ozawa, in rare private conversations with trusted staff, allowed himself to speak of the irreplaceable nature of experienced pilots and the difficulty of replacing what had already been spent. These were not complaints. They were acknowledgments of reality spoken by men who understood that reality could not be wished away. The Pacific had already taught all three commanders hard lessons about the difference between plans on paper and the chaos of actual battle. Spruance had seen how quickly circumstances could change when an enemy refused to behave as expected. Mitcher had learned that even the best aircraft and the bravest pilots could be lost to weather, to mechanical failure, to the simple mathematics of distance and fuel. Ozawa had watched his nation's early advantages erode as the enemy adapted and grew stronger. Each carried those lessons into the present moment, shaping the way they weighed risk against necessity, aggression against protection, the desire for decisive victory against the duty to bring as many of their men home as possible. What none of them could know with certainty was how the coming days would test those calculations. The fleets were already moving, the young men under their command already writing letters and checking equipment and trying to sleep in the knowledge that soon everything would change. The admirals carried the largest share of the visible responsibility, yet they also carried something quieter and more personal. The knowledge that history would judge them not only by the outcome of battles but by the manner in which they had borne the weight of deciding who lived and who did not. These are the kinds of burdens that rarely appear in the official records, the private struggles of command that shape events in ways no map can fully capture. And if you want to see the raw, unfiltered reality behind those decisions, the faces and the cost that official histories sometimes soften, there is a special digital collection available on Gumroad that contains unseen photographs and footage from the Pacific War, material too graphic and honest to share openly on this platform. It offers a deeper, unflinching look at what these commanders and the men they led actually faced. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The three men continued their preparations, each in his own way shouldering what could not be shared. The ocean between them continued to shrink. And somewhere ahead, beyond the reach of any single decision, the battle that would test all of them was drawing closer with every passing hour. far out on the Pacific where the horizon never seemed to end and the only constant was the long, slow roll of the sea against steel hulls. A young American sailor named Jack stood at the railing of his carrier and reread the letter from his mother for what must have been the 100th time. The paper had grown soft and wrinkled from the damp air and from being folded and unfolded in his pocket during long watches. In the letter she wrote about the garden back home, about how the tomatoes were coming in early this year, and about how his younger brother had started asking when Jack would be home to teach him how to throw a proper curveball. Jack traced the words with his thumb and tried to picture the small house on the edge of town, the way the light fell across the kitchen table in the late afternoon. It felt impossibly far away. The voyage had already stretched on for what seemed like forever. Day after day the fleet moved westward, a vast armada of carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers stretching across miles of ocean. From the deck Jack could see other ships rising and falling with the same swells, their wakes cutting white lines through the blue. Sometimes at night the glow of their lights would appear like distant stars when the blackout rules allowed a brief moment of visibility. The men around him had grown used to the routine. Reveille came early, followed by breakfast that tasted the same every morning, then drills that sent them scrambling to their stations until their muscles ached and their lungs burned from the smoke of practice fires. In between there was time for cards, for writing letters, for staring at the empty horizon and wondering what waited beyond it. Jack had joined the Navy because he believed the war needed to be fought and because staying home while others went felt wrong. Now, after months at sea and after losing friends in earlier operations, the certainty had been replaced by something quieter and more complicated. He still believed in the cause. He still wanted to see the fighting end. But he also carried a growing awareness that the ocean could take a man without warning or mercy, and that many of the boys who laughed and joked in the mess hall might not laugh again once the battle began. He had started keeping a small notebook where he wrote down the names of shipmates who had not come back from previous fights. It was not something he showed anyone. It was his private way of remembering that every ship in this enormous fleet carried its own stories of loss and of the people who had been left behind on distant shores. On the same endless water but moving from a different direction, a young Japanese pilot named Kenji sat in the ready room of his carrier and tried to focus on the map spread across the table. The lines on the paper represented islands and sea lanes, yet what Kenji saw when he looked at it were the faces of the men who had already been lost in earlier battles. Many of his instructors from flight school were gone. The senior pilots who had once guided the younger ones through their first carrier landings had mostly vanished into the same ocean that now carried this fleet toward whatever waited ahead. Kenji had been rushed through training along with hundreds of others like him. He could fly, he could navigate, he could even land on the moving deck when the sea was calm. What he lacked was the deep, instinctive feel for combat that only came from surviving many missions, and he knew it. Kenji had written a letter to his parents the night before the fleet sortied. He had tried to sound confident, describing the pride he felt in serving and the certainty that this next operation would bring honor to the nation. He had not written about the way his hands sometimes shook when he climbed into the cockpit, or about the dreams that woke him in the narrow bunk where he heard the roar of engines that were not there. In the letter he asked his mother to look after the small garden he had planted before leaving home, the one with the cherry tree his father had helped him set in the ground. He did not say that he wondered whether he would ever see the tree bloom again. Some things were better left unsaid, even to the people you loved most. The two fleets moved toward each other across the same vast stretch of water, though neither side knew the other's exact position yet. On the American ships the tension showed in small ways. Officers stayed longer over charts and the flag plot. Pilots checked and rechecked their aircraft during the long days, running their hands along wings and engines as if touch could reveal problems that instruments might miss. Sailors on watch scanned the horizon with binoculars until their eyes watered, then passed the glasses to the next man without a word. The routine continued, but beneath it ran a current of awareness that this voyage was different from the ones that had come before. They were heading toward islands that mattered more than most, places that could change the reach of the war itself if they were taken and held. Jack felt it in the way conversations quieted when someone mentioned the coming landing on Saipan, and the way older hands sometimes placed a steadying grip on a younger shoulder during drills. On the Japanese side, the tension took a different shape. The pilots and sailors knew their fleet was moving out for what many believed would be the decisive clash. There was pride in that knowledge, a sense that they were being given the chance to strike a blow that could still turn the tide. Yet there was also the private understanding, shared in quiet conversations between trusted friends, that the odds were not in their favor. Kenji heard it in the way some of the veteran mechanics spoke about conserving parts and fuel, and the way the senior officers looked at the young pilots with a mixture of encouragement and something closer to sorrow. The young men responded the only way they knew how. They flew the practice missions with extra determination. They helped one another with equipment checks. They shared cigarettes and stories from home during the rare moments when the work paused. These small acts of kindness became their way of pushing back against the fear that none of them named out loud. The ocean itself seemed to grow larger the farther they traveled. Days blended into one another with only the position of the sun and the changing color of the water to mark the passage of time. Jack found himself thinking more often about the families waiting back home, about the ordinary lives that continued without them. He wondered what his mother would be doing at that exact moment, whether she was hanging laundry or sitting at the kitchen table with the radio on. The thought gave him both comfort and a sharp ache. On the Japanese carriers, Kenji and the others around him spoke less about home as the days passed. Instead, they focused on the work in front of them, on the routines that kept their minds occupied and their bodies moving. Yet in the quiet watches, when the only sounds were the engines and the slap of waves against the hull, the same thoughts returned. They carried photographs in their pockets and letters in their sea bags, the same small anchors that men on the other side of the ocean carried. There were moments of unexpected lightness even in the growing tension. On one American carrier, a group of sailors organized an impromptu contest to see who could guess the exact time the sun would set, using only the feel of the wind and the color of the clouds. The winner received a share of someone's hidden stash of candy from a care package. The laughter that followed felt louder than it should have in the middle of so much empty water. On a Japanese carrier, Kenji watched as an older mechanic patiently showed a frightened young recruit how to secure a parachute harness so it would not tangle if he had to jump. The older man's hands were steady, his voice calm, and when the task was finished he clapped the younger one on the shoulder and told him he had done well. These were not grand gestures. They were the ordinary ways men reminded one another that they were not alone in the vastness. As the fleets continued their approach, the sense of something approaching grew stronger on both sides. It showed in the way officers began to speak more directly about what might be required in the coming days. It showed in the extra care pilots took with their maps and navigation notes. It showed in the letters that grew longer and more careful, as if the writers sensed they might be running out of time to say everything they wanted to say. Jack finished another letter to his mother and sealed it carefully, then added it to the small bundle he kept in his locker. He did not know when it would be mailed, only that he wanted it ready if the chance came. Kenji did the same with the letter to his parents, folding it into the waterproof pouch he carried and then tucking the pouch inside his flight jacket where it would stay close to him. The Pacific had already swallowed so many ships and so many lives in the years of fighting. It had taken men from both nations without regard for which side they served. Yet the ocean also connected them in ways neither side fully understood. The same swells that lifted an American carrier also lifted a Japanese one hundreds of miles away. The same wind that filled the sails of a lookout's imagination carried the scent of salt and fuel across both fleets. In the middle of that shared emptiness, men on both sides carried the same mix of hope and fear. Hope that the coming battle might bring the war closer to an end. Fear that it would instead demand more than they had left to give. Jack thought about that mix one evening as he stood on the flight deck and watched the sun sink into the water. He had seen enough of the war to know that victory and loss often walked side by side, that even a successful operation left behind empty bunks and unmailed letters. Yet he also believed that the push toward these islands mattered, that taking them would give his country a stronger position and perhaps shorten the fighting for everyone still caught in it. The thought did not remove the fear, but it gave the fear a shape he could carry. Kenji reached a similar place in his own thoughts. He understood that his side was asking everything from the men who remained. He understood that many would not return. Yet he also carried the belief that doing his duty here, in this place, was the only honorable path left. The photographs he kept and the letters he wrote were his way of holding on to the world beyond the war, even as the war demanded more of him with every passing day. The fleets kept moving. The letters kept being written and folded and hidden away. The small kindnesses continued in the spaces between the work and the waiting. And across the same ocean that had already taken so much, two groups of men who had never met and would likely never meet drew steadily closer to the moment that would test everything they carried inside them. These are the quiet human threads that run through every great clash at sea, the personal hopes and fears that no map or plan can fully capture. Keeping stories like these alive, stories of ordinary men caught in extraordinary times, requires real dedication and many hours of careful work. If these accounts have stayed with you and you want to help more of them reach the light, even a small tip on Ko-Fi, as little as $1, makes a genuine difference in sustaining the research and the time it takes to bring these moments forward so they are not forgotten. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The horizon remained empty for now, but the men on both sides could feel the distance shrinking with every turn of the screws and every mile of blue water left behind. Somewhere ahead the two fleets would find each other, and when they did the ocean that had carried them this far would become something else entirely. In the narrow cockpit of a search plane droning alone over the empty Pacific, a young American pilot named Mike leaned forward against his harness and squinted at the horizon until his eyes burned, knowing that somewhere out there an entire enemy fleet was moving and that missing it could cost thousands of lives before the sun set again. The search had begun before first light. From the decks of the American carriers, groups of planes had lifted into the gray dawn one after another, their engines straining against the weight of extra fuel tanks and the long distances they were expected to cover. Mike had flown these missions before, but this time felt different. The briefing officers had spoken in quieter voices than usual. They had not needed to say much. Everyone understood that the Japanese fleet was out there somewhere, and that finding it first would decide who struck the opening blow in the battle everyone sensed was coming. Mike flew with a crew of 3. The radio man sat behind him, headphones on, listening to the steady stream of position reports and weather updates. The gunner manned the turret, scanning the sky for any sign of enemy fighters that might be hunting the hunters. Below them the ocean stretched in every direction, a vast, indifferent blue that offered no landmarks and no mercy. Hours passed in the steady thrum of the engines and the occasional crackle of the radio. Mike kept his eyes moving across the water, looking for the thin white line of a wake, the dark shape of a hull, the telltale disturbance that might mean a ship was passing beneath the surface. His shoulders ached from holding the same position. His mouth was dry from the recycled air in the cockpit. Still he flew on, because turning back too soon could mean the difference between victory and disaster for the fleet behind him. On the American flagship the staff waited for those search planes to report. The admirals and their officers moved through the flag plot with the careful, contained energy of men who knew that every hour without contact increased the chance the enemy might find them first. Reports came in slowly at first. One plane after another called in negative sightings, their voices calm but edged with the fatigue of long flights over nothing. The tension in the room grew with each passing message. Men checked and rechecked charts, measured distances with dividers, and spoke in low voices about possible courses the Japanese might be taking. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. The weight of what was at stake pressed down on everyone present. Mike's plane was one of the last to call in that morning. He had flown farther than most, pushing the fuel reserves because something in his gut told him the enemy was not where the earlier reports suggested. The radio man had begun to suggest they turn back when Mike spotted it. At first it was only a smudge on the horizon, a darker patch against the blue. He banked the plane slightly, hard hammering, and told the crew to stay sharp. As they drew closer, the smudge resolved into shapes. Ships. Many ships. The radio man's voice cracked slightly when he began transmitting the sighting report. Mike kept the plane steady, circling at a safe distance while the gunner watched for fighters, and the radio man repeated the position, course, and estimated number of vessels. When the transmission was finished, there was a moment of silence in the cockpit. They all knew what they had just done. They had found the Japanese fleet. The waiting was over. The battle had begun in the moment that report left the radio. Back on the flagship, the message arrived like a current through the room. Officers gathered around the chart table as the position was plotted. The atmosphere shifted from waiting to action without anyone needing to give an order. Men who had been standing still now moved with purpose. The admirals conferred in quiet voices, already thinking through the next moves. Yet even in that moment of discovery there was no celebration. Too many searches in the past had ended with planes shot down or with sightings that proved false. Until the contact was confirmed and the enemy's intentions became clearer, the tension remained. Mike's crew turned for home with their fuel gauges dropping and their nerves still singing from what they had seen. They did not know yet how their report would shape the hours ahead. They only knew they had done the job they were sent to do. Far across the same ocean, the Japanese search effort was unfolding with its own quiet desperation. A Japanese pilot named Sato climbed into his seaplane on the deck of a cruiser and prepared for another long patrol. Like Mike, Sato had flown many such missions. Unlike Mike, he carried the additional knowledge that his side was searching from a position of disadvantage. The Japanese fleet needed to locate the American carriers quickly if they were to launch their planned strikes before the enemy could respond. Sato's plane was older, its engine louder, its range more limited than the American search aircraft. He knew this every time he took off. He also knew that if he and the other search crews failed to find the American fleet, the carefully prepared plan for a decisive battle could unravel before it began. Sato's flight was long and lonely. He flew low at times to scan the water more closely, then climbed again to extend his view. The sun climbed with him, turning the ocean into a blinding sheet of light that made his eyes water behind his goggles. His observer in the rear seat called out possible contacts that turned out to be nothing more than whitecaps or the shadows of clouds. Each time the disappointment settled a little heavier. Sato thought about the young pilots waiting back on the carriers, the ones who would have to fly into whatever the searchers found. He thought about his own family and the letters he had not yet finished writing. The war had already taken so much from so many. The thought that this search might determine whether more lives were spent or spared pressed on him as steadily as the drone of the engine. When Sato finally spotted the American ships, the moment arrived with a strange mix of relief and dread. He made his sighting report in the same calm voice he had used for negative reports earlier, but his hands were tight on the controls as he turned the plane away. He knew the Americans would have radar and fighters. He knew his chances of returning to his own ship were now lower than they had been an hour earlier. Yet he also knew he had given his fleet the information it needed. The game of search and detection had tipped in their favor, at least for the moment. As he flew back toward his own forces, Sato allowed himself one brief thought of home before pushing it away. There would be time for such thoughts later, if he lived to have them. On both sides, the moment of contact changed everything and nothing at once. The fleets now had rough positions for each other. The admirals on each flagship began adjusting courses and preparing their next moves. Yet the ocean was still vast, and a single report did not guarantee that the enemy would be found again if they changed direction. The search continued even after the first sightings. More planes launched. Submarines that had been patrolling ahead of the main forces received new orders to watch specific areas. The men in those submarines lived in a different kind of tension. In the control room of one American boat, the crew had been running silent for days. The only sounds were the soft hum of the battery motors and the occasional whisper of orders. The sonar operator sat with headphones on, listening to the sea the way a hunter listens to the forest. Hours passed with nothing but the natural sounds of water and distant marine life. Then, faintly at first, came the rhythmic beat of propellers. The operator's hand tightened on the headset. He called the contact to the officer of the deck in a low, steady voice that did not betray the sudden rush of adrenaline he felt. The captain came forward immediately. For several minutes they listened together, confirming the bearing and estimating the speed. When they were certain, the captain gave the order to close the range. The boat turned slowly, carefully, trying to remain undetected while moving toward the sound that could mean an enemy carrier or a destroyer screen. Every man in the control room knew that one mistake, one unnecessary noise, could turn the hunter into the hunted. The same kind of moment was unfolding in Japanese submarines positioned to intercept the American advance. Their crews listened to the same sea, waited through the same long silences, and felt the same jolt when contact finally came. In those cramped, dimly lit spaces, men who had not spoken for hours suddenly found their voices again as reports were passed and courses were adjusted. The tension was the same on both sides because the stakes were the same. Being the first to find the enemy offered an advantage. Being found first could mean sudden and overwhelming attack from the air or from surface ships. Back on the carriers, the men who flew the search planes returned to decks that were already preparing for what might come next. Mike's crew climbed out of their aircraft stiff and tired, their faces showing the strain of the long flight. Other pilots who had not yet flown waited near their planes, watching the returning crews for any sign of what they had seen. When word of the sighting spread, the atmosphere on the ship changed in small but noticeable ways. Conversations grew shorter. Movements became more purposeful. In the ready rooms, pilots checked their gear one more time even though they had already done so that morning. Some wrote quick notes to be left behind if they did not return. Others simply sat in silence, each man alone with his own thoughts about what the sighting meant for him and for the friends he flew with. The same quiet shift occurred on the Japanese carriers. Sato's report arrived and was quickly passed to the flag officers. Pilots who had been resting were called to briefing. Mechanics worked faster on aircraft that might soon be needed. In the ready rooms, young pilots listened to the details of the American position and tried to picture what they would face when they launched. Some of them had never flown against the enemy before. Others had survived earlier battles and carried the memory of lost friends in the way they checked their equipment and spoke to the newer men with extra patience. The deadly game of search and detection had done its work. Both fleets now knew they were not alone on the ocean. The long period of waiting and wondering was ending. What would follow would be decided by how well each side used the information the searchers had risked their lives to bring back. Mike sat on the edge of his bunk later that day and thought about the ships he had seen from the air. He wondered how many men were aboard them, how many of them were thinking about home the same way he was. He did not feel triumph. He felt the heavy responsibility of having set something in motion that he could not stop. Sato, back on his own ship, felt something similar. He had done his duty. He had found the enemy. Now others would decide what to do with that knowledge, and he would fly again when ordered, carrying the same mix of determination and private fear that every man in every search plane carried. These moments of discovery, the long hours of searching and the sudden, heart-stopping instant when contact was made, are the hidden hinges on which great battles turn. The men who flew those patrols and listened in those submarine control rooms lived with a tension that rarely appears in official accounts. If you want to go deeper into these unseen stories, to hear extended conversations with historians and to see raw footage and photographs that show the unfiltered reality of those searches and the men who conducted them, our Patreon community offers exactly that. There you can access free podcasts, unblurred video sections, and join a group of fellow history enthusiasts who care about preserving these personal moments as much as we do. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The fleets continued to close the distance. The search planes kept flying. The submarines kept listening. And in the ready rooms and control rooms on both sides, men waited for the next report that would tell them whether they had found their enemy or whether their enemy had found them first. In the pre-dawn quiet aboard a Japanese carrier, a young pilot named Akira stood on the flight deck with his flight helmet under one arm and a small photograph of his family pressed against his chest, knowing that the planes lining up behind him were about to carry hundreds of men into a sky that might not let them return. The launch order had come in the early hours. Akira had not slept much. He had lain in his narrow bunk listening to the steady thrum of the ship's engines and the occasional footsteps of men moving through the passageways. When the call came, he dressed carefully, folding the photograph into the pocket of his flight suit where it would stay close to him. Around him other pilots did the same. Some spoke in low voices about the mission ahead. Others remained silent, their faces showing the strain of too many short nights and too many friends already gone. Akira noticed one of the newer pilots, a boy barely out of training, struggling with the strap on his parachute. Without a word, an older pilot stepped over and helped him secure it, his hand steady even though his own eyes carried the same tiredness. These small acts of care had become part of the routine before every launch. They did not change what was coming, but they reminded every man that he was not entirely alone. The deck crews moved with practiced efficiency in the dim light. Engines coughed to life one after another, the sound growing into a roar that filled the air and vibrated through the steel beneath their feet. Akira climbed into his cockpit and went through the familiar checks, his hands moving automatically while his mind drifted to the faces he had left behind. He thought of his younger sister who had written to him about school and about how she was learning to play a new song on the piano. He thought of his parents and the quiet way his father had placed a hand on his shoulder the last time they spoke. He had not told them how many of his squadron mates had already been lost in earlier operations. There had been no point in adding that weight to the letters that might be the last they ever received from him. As the first wave began to launch, Akira watched the planes ahead of him roll forward and lift into the gray sky. Each takeoff carried a moment of held breath on the deck. The ship's bow rose and fell with the swells, and every pilot had to time his run perfectly or risk going into the sea. When his turn came, Akira advanced the throttle and felt the familiar push of acceleration. The deck rushed beneath him and then fell away. He was airborne, climbing and joining the formation that was already turning toward the reported position of the American fleet. Behind him more planes were launching. Wave after wave rose from the carriers, the sound of their engines fading into the distance as they headed west. On the American side, the first signs of the approaching storm appeared on radar screens well before the Japanese planes came into visual range. In the fighter direction center aboard one of the carriers, a young lieutenant named Ryan sat with headphones on and watched the glowing blips begin to appear at the edge of the scope. He had been on duty for hours already, but the sudden cluster of contacts brought a fresh surge of focus. He spoke calmly into his microphone, directing the combat air patrol already in the air to investigate and calling for additional fighters to be launched from the ready decks. Around him other officers tracked the incoming tracks, their voices steady as they passed information between ships. The system they had built over months of practice was working exactly as it should. Radar gave them warning. Trained directors gave them the ability to place fighters in the right place at the right time. Yet even with that advantage, no one in the room took the situation lightly. They knew the Japanese were coming in strength, and they knew that every minute counted. Ryan thought briefly of the pilots he was vectoring into the path of the enemy. He had met some of them during brief visits to the ready rooms. He knew their names and the way they tried to sound casual when they talked about the next mission. He also knew that many of them were young, some barely older than the students he had once taught back home before the war. When he gave an order that sent a division of Hellcats climbing toward an incoming wave, he carried the quiet awareness that those orders would decide who lived and who did not in the next few minutes. It was a weight he had learned to carry without letting it show in his voice. In the cockpits of the American fighters already airborne, the pilots received the vectors and turned toward the threat. One of them, a lieutenant named Tom who had flown through earlier campaigns, felt the familiar tightening in his chest as he climbed. He had learned to read the tone of the fighter director's voice. Today the instructions came with an edge that told him this was not another false alarm. Tom checked his guns and his fuel, then glanced at the other planes in his section. They were spread out in loose formation, each man scanning the sky ahead. The sun was climbing now, turning the ocean below into a sheet of light that made it harder to spot anything low on the horizon. Tom knew the Japanese would be coming at altitude, and he knew his Hellcat could outclimb and outfight most of what they would send. Still, the knowledge did not remove the tension. Every pilot who had survived this long understood that skill and equipment could only do so much when the sky filled with enemy aircraft. The first Japanese wave appeared as small dots that grew rapidly into recognizable shapes. Akira was part of that wave, flying in formation with the other planes from his carrier. He could see the American fighters turning to meet them, and he felt a cold clarity settle over him. There was no turning back now. His orders were to press the attack on the American carriers. He knew the odds were against him and the men flying beside him. The training he had received had been shorter than it should have been. Many of the experienced pilots who could have taught him the finer points of survival in a dogfight were already gone. Yet he flew on because the alternative was to abandon the mission and the comrades who depended on every plane reaching its target. The sky over the American fleet began to fill with the chaos of the first clashes. American Hellcats tore into the Japanese formations with speed and coordination that the attackers had not expected. From the decks below, sailors and officers watched the distant flashes and the trails of smoke as planes fell. On the Japanese carriers, the crews waited for news from the returning planes that had not yet come back. The second wave was already preparing to launch. Akira's group had been part of the first. Some of them would not return. The men still on deck knew this, yet they continued their work because stopping was not an option. In the Fighter Direction Center, Ryan continued to direct traffic, his voice remaining calm even as the number of contacts on the scope multiplied. He could hear the radio chatter from the pilots in the air, the short, clipped reports of engagements. He vectored fresh fighters to where they were needed most and pulled others back when their fuel ran low. The system was working, but it was being tested by the sheer number of aircraft the Japanese had sent. Ryan thought about the young pilots who were now fighting for their lives miles away. He thought about the families who would receive telegrams if those pilots did not come home. The responsibility sat with him in the quiet way he passed each new vector, and the way he double-checked every decision before he spoke it into the microphone. Tom found himself in the middle of the first large engagement. A group of Japanese planes appeared ahead of him, and he led his section into the attack. The Hellcat responded instantly to his inputs, climbing and turning with a responsiveness that gave him confidence even in the middle of the fight. He saw one enemy plane go down in flames and felt no triumph, only the focused need to keep moving and to protect the men flying with him. Around him the sky was filled with twisting aircraft and the white streaks of tracers. Radio calls overlapped. Someone shouted a warning about a plane on his tail. Tom rolled hard and came around on another target. In those moments there was no room for fear or reflection. There was only the next maneuver, the next burst of fire, the next check to make sure his wingman was still there. On the Japanese side, the reality of the situation was becoming clear to those who survived the first passes. Akira's formation had been hit hard. Planes were falling around him. He pressed on toward the reported position of the American carriers, but the number of enemy fighters seemed to grow with every minute. He had been told that land-based aircraft from nearby islands would join the attack and help overwhelm the American defenses. Yet as he flew, he saw no sign of that support arriving in time. The plan had called for coordinated strikes from multiple directions. What was happening instead was a series of separate waves meeting a defense that was already alert and coordinated. Akira felt the weight of that realization settle in his chest even as he continued to fly toward his target. Back on the American carriers, the second and third waves were already being detected on radar. The fighter direction teams worked without pause, sending fresh pilots into the air and bringing others down to rearm and refuel. The deck crews moved with the same steady efficiency they had shown during the search phase, but now there was an added urgency. Every minute a fighter spent on the deck was a minute it was not in the air protecting the fleet. Ryan stayed at his post, his voice growing hoarse but never losing its calm authority. He had begun to understand the scale of what the Japanese were attempting. They were throwing everything they had into this attack, and they were doing it with men who in many cases had far less experience than the Americans they were facing. The human cost was already visible in the reports coming back from the pilots. American losses were light compared to what the Japanese were suffering, but every loss was still a man who would not return to his ship or his family. Tom landed after his first engagement with his ammunition nearly gone and his plane showing the marks of near misses. He climbed out and walked toward the ready room, his legs unsteady from the tension of the fight. Other pilots were doing the same. Some spoke quietly about what they had seen. Others sat in silence, still processing the speed and violence of the morning. In the ready room, a young pilot who had just returned from his first combat mission sat with his head in his hands. An older hand placed a cup of coffee in front of him without a word and then moved on to check his own aircraft. These small gestures continued even as the radar screens kept lighting up with new threats. On the Japanese carriers, the mood was heavier. The first wave had taken heavy losses, and the men preparing the second wave could see the empty spots on the flight deck where planes and crews should have been. Yet the launches continued. Akira had not returned. The men who had known him went about their work with the same outward calm they had shown before every other launch, but the silence between them carried its own weight. One of the deck crew paused for a moment beside the spot where Akira's plane had been parked. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cloth he had been given weeks earlier to wipe oil from engine parts. He folded it carefully and placed it on the deck for a moment before picking it up again and continuing his work. It was a private gesture, unnoticed by most, but it was the only way he could mark the absence of a young man who had shared his cigarettes and his quiet jokes during the long nights at sea. The first Japanese attacks had unfolded exactly as the High Command had hoped in terms of numbers and determination. Wave after wave had been sent toward the American fleet. What the planners had not fully accounted for was the advantage the Americans held in radar warning and fighter direction, and in the experience of the pilots who met those waves. The Japanese pilots flew with courage and with the belief that their sacrifice might still turn the course of the war. Many of them understood that the odds were against them, yet they climbed into their cockpits and flew toward the enemy because that was what duty required. The Americans met them with a defense that was already in motion before the first Japanese plane came within sight of the fleet. The result was beginning to take shape in the sky above the carriers, in the falling planes, and in the growing realization on both sides that this day would exact a heavier price from one fleet than from the other. These opening waves carried more than aircraft and bombs. They carried the private fears and the quiet courage of men who knew they might not see another sunrise. They carried the small acts of kindness that men offer one another when they sense the end may be near. And they carried the first clear signs that the balance of experience and preparation in the Pacific had shifted in ways that no amount of determination could fully overcome. The personal stories behind these attacks, the hidden coordination and the individual moments of sacrifice that shaped the morning, are the kind of details that often get lost in broader accounts of the battle. If you want to explore more of those forgotten layers, including the secret operations and the unsung individuals whose actions changed the course of the war in ways that rarely make the history books, I invite you to sign up for our free email newsletter. You will receive the exclusive ebook The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II, along with weekly deep dives that bring those hidden stories to light. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The sky above the American fleet remained filled with the sound of engines and the trails of smoke as the morning wore on. More Japanese waves were still coming. More American fighters were still rising to meet them. And on both sides, the men who flew and the men who directed them carried the same knowledge that every decision made in these hours would echo far beyond the horizon they could see. In the middle of the afternoon sky above the American fleet, a Hellcat pilot named Tom rolled hard to avoid a burst of tracers and caught a glimpse of 3 Japanese planes going down in flames within seconds of each other, the ocean below already dotted with the dark shapes of wreckage and the white blossoms of parachutes that seemed to appear faster than he could count. Tom had been in the air for what felt like hours. His squadron had launched again after a quick refuel and rearm, and the sky had turned into something he had never seen before. Japanese aircraft were coming in wave after wave, but they were being met by coordinated groups of American fighters who had the advantage of altitude, speed, and the steady stream of vectors coming from the ships below. Tom's wingmen stayed close, calling out threats and covering his turns. Together they had already accounted for several enemy planes. Each time Tom lined up a shot and saw the enemy aircraft begin to burn or spin away, he felt a complicated mix of relief and something closer to sorrow. These were men in those cockpits. Some of them were probably no older than he was. Yet they kept coming, and he kept firing because stopping would mean letting them reach the carriers where thousands of his own shipmates waited. On the decks far below, the fighter direction teams continued to work without pause. Radar screens showed the incoming tracks, and comm voices sent fresh divisions of Hellcats climbing to meet them. The system that had been built over months of training was now operating at its full capacity. Pilots who had been on the ground only minutes earlier were already back in the air, their faces still showing the strain of the previous engagements but their hands steady on the controls. Tom could hear the radio chatter of other squadrons reporting kills and asking for help. The tone was professional, almost matter-of-fact, but underneath it ran the shared knowledge that this was unlike anything they had faced before. The Japanese were not turning away. They were pressing the attack with a determination that spoke of orders that left little room for retreat. Tom thought about the men he was fighting. In earlier battles he had sometimes wondered about the pilots on the other side, about whether they had families waiting or letters they had written before taking off. Today those thoughts came faster and heavier. He saw a Japanese plane break apart in front of him and felt no sense of victory, only the urgent need to keep moving and to make sure the next threat did not catch him from behind. His wingman called a warning, and Tom pulled into a tight turn that pressed him hard into his seat. Another enemy plane flashed past, and he rolled after it, firing a short burst that sent it tumbling toward the sea. He did not watch it hit the water. There was no time. Another contact was already being called out on the radio. Farther out in the same sky, a Japanese pilot named Akira was flying in what remained of his formation. The first waves had suffered badly, and the planes still in the air were now scattered and fighting for survival rather than pressing a coordinated attack. Akira's aircraft had been hit once already, and he could feel the controls growing sluggish. He had watched friends disappear in bursts of flame and smoke. The American fighters seemed to be everywhere, appearing out of the sun or climbing from below with a speed and agility his own plane could not match. He had been told that this attack would overwhelm the enemy with numbers and determination. What he was experiencing instead was a sky that had turned against them in ways no one on the ground had fully prepared them for. Akira tried to stay with 2 other planes from his squadron, but the Americans kept cutting them apart. He saw one of his remaining comrades go down and felt a sharp, personal grief that cut through the fear. They had shared a meal the night before, talking quietly about home and about the small things they missed. Now that man was gone, and Akira was alone in a sky that offered no safety. He turned toward the direction of the American carriers, still trying to complete the mission he had been given, but the number of enemy fighters between him and his target seemed to grow with every passing minute. His hands were steady on the stick, but his mind kept returning to the photograph he carried in his pocket and to the letter he had not finished writing. There was no time for those thoughts now. Survival required every bit of attention he had left. On the American carriers, the men who were not in the air watched the battle unfold in the distance. From the flight decks they could see the high trails of smoke and the occasional flash of an explosion. Some of the returning pilots landed with their planes showing the marks of close combat. Deck crews swarmed over the aircraft, refueling and rearming them with the same steady efficiency they had shown all morning. In the ready rooms, pilots who had just come back sat for a few minutes before the next launch. They spoke in short sentences about what they had seen. One young pilot described how a Japanese plane had flown straight through a formation without firing, as if the pilot had already accepted what was coming. Another mentioned seeing parachutes in the water and wondering whether rescue planes would be able to reach them before dark. These conversations were not celebrations. They were the way men tried to make sense of something that had moved beyond anything their training had prepared them for. Tom landed briefly to refuel and rearm again. As he climbed out of the cockpit, he saw the faces of the deck crew who had been working without rest since before dawn. One of them handed him a cup of water without a word. Tom nodded his thanks and drank it quickly before climbing back into the plane. There was no time for longer exchanges. The radar reports were still showing more incoming aircraft, and every fighter that could fly was needed in the air. As he took off again, he felt the familiar push of the deck beneath him and the sudden freedom of being airborne. The sky ahead was still filled with the signs of battle. He climbed toward the next vector and tried not to think about how many more times he would have to do this before the day ended. Akira's situation had grown worse. His plane was losing power, and he could see American fighters closing in from two directions. He tried one last turn to escape, but the controls no longer responded the way they should. In those final moments, he thought of the faces of his family and of the small garden he had helped plant before leaving home. He did not feel anger toward the men who were about to shoot him down. He felt only a deep, quiet sadness that the war had brought him to this place and that he would not be able to keep the promises he had made in his last letter. When the tracers found his aircraft, he felt the impact, but not much pain. The world tilted and then went dark as the plane fell toward the sea far below. Tom saw the Japanese plane go down and felt the same complicated mix of emotions he had felt all afternoon. He checked his fuel and his ammunition, then turned toward the next contact the fighter director was calling. The battle showed no sign of slowing. More Japanese planes were still arriving, though their formations were looser now and their attacks less coordinated. The Americans continued to meet them with the same steady professionalism. Tom's wingman stayed with him through another engagement, and together they brought down two more enemy aircraft before the radio called them back toward the fleet. As they flew home, Tom looked down at the ocean and saw the scattered wreckage of the afternoon's fighting. He knew that many of the men in those planes had been doing exactly what he was doing, following orders and trying to survive. The knowledge did not change what had to be done, but it stayed with him as he lined up for landing. On the Japanese carriers, the mood had shifted from determination to a growing sense of something gone terribly wrong. The second and third waves had launched, but few of the planes were returning. The men still on deck worked with the same outward calm, but conversations had grown shorter and the silences between them heavier. One deck officer paused beside a young pilot who was about to climb into his aircraft for what might be the last launch of the day. The officer placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder and said something quiet that Tom could not hear from where he stood. The pilot nodded once and then climbed into the cockpit. These small gestures of care continued even as the scale of the losses became impossible to ignore. The sky above the American fleet had become a place where the advantage the Japanese had hoped to gain through numbers was being steadily erased by better aircraft, better training, and the unseen coordination of radar and fighter direction. American pilots like Tom were not simply shooting down planes. They were part of a system that allowed them to find and engage the enemy before the enemy could reach the carriers. Japanese pilots like Akira were flying into that system with courage and with orders that left little room for anything else. The result was a slaughter that unfolded over the course of a single afternoon, with hundreds of aircraft falling into the sea and with the men who flew them carrying the full human weight of what was happening. Tom landed again as the light began to change. He climbed out of the cockpit and walked toward the ready room with legs that felt heavier than they had that morning. Other pilots were doing the same. Some of them had scored multiple victories. Others had simply survived. In the ready room they sat together without saying much at first. One man pulled out a small notebook and wrote something quickly before putting it away. Another accepted a cup of coffee from a shipmate and held it in both hands as if drawing warmth from it. These were not men celebrating a great victory. They were men who had seen too much death in too short a time and who were trying to find their way back to something that felt ordinary. The Japanese losses that afternoon were unlike anything their naval air arm had suffered before. The pilots who had launched with hope and determination had met a defense that was already waiting for them. Many of them had flown with the knowledge that their training had been shorter than it should have been and that their aircraft could not match what the Americans were flying. Yet they had gone anyway, because that was what was asked of them. The men who remained on the Japanese carriers watched the empty flight decks and the missing faces and understood that something fundamental had changed. The sky that had once belonged to them had turned against them in ways that courage alone could not overcome. Tom sat on the edge of his bunk later that evening and thought about the day. He had done what was required of him. He had protected the fleet and the men who served on it. He had also taken lives in numbers that would stay with him long after the battle ended. He thought about writing a letter home but found that the words would not come easily. Instead, he sat in the quiet and let the sounds of the ship around him fill the space where his thoughts were still too raw to put on paper. Somewhere in the same fleet other pilots were doing the same. Some wrote letters. Some stared at photographs they carried. Some simply sat in silence, trying to make sense of what they had seen and done. The afternoon had shown in the clearest possible way how much the balance in the Pacific had shifted. American pilots with better aircraft and better preparation had met Japanese pilots who were being asked to do more than their training and equipment could support. The result was a slaughter that would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, but for the men who lived through it the memory was not of easy victories. It was of smoke and fire in the sky, of friends who did not return, and of the quiet understanding that war had demanded more from them than any of them had expected when they first climbed into their cockpits. These are the kinds of stories that deserve to be remembered not just in words but in ways we can see and hold on to. If the courage and the cost of what happened in those skies has stayed with you, there is a powerful film called Midway that brings the heart of the Pacific Carrier War to life with respect and intensity. And it is available to stream right now on Prime Video. Or if you prefer something tangible, our trusted partners on Amazon offer some truly remarkable WW2 memorabilia that lets you connect with that history in a personal way. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The sun was setting over an ocean that had received hundreds of aircraft and the men who flew them. On the American carriers, the pilots who had survived the day prepared for whatever the night might bring. On the Japanese carriers, the remaining crews looked at the empty spaces on their flight decks and knew that the battle they had hoped would change everything had instead revealed how much had already been lost. The sky had turned against them, and nothing that happened in the hours ahead could change what the afternoon had already decided. In the cramped control room of an American submarine moving silently through the dark water, A young sonar operator named Ellis kept his headphones pressed tight against his ears and felt a cold clarity settle over him as the steady, rhythmic sound of many propellers grew louder with every passing minute. The boat had been on patrol for days, running deep and quiet while the great fleets above them maneuvered toward their collision. Ellis had grown used to the long stretches of nothing but the natural sounds of the sea. Now those sounds were changing. The propeller beats were too many and too organized to belong to anything except a major formation. He called the contact to the officer of the deck in a low, steady voice that did not show the sudden rush of adrenaline he felt. The captain came forward at once. For several minutes the small group of men listened together, confirming bearings and estimating speed and course. When they were certain, the captain gave the order to close the range. The submarine turned slowly, carefully, trying to remain undetected while moving toward the sound that could mean carriers or destroyers or both. Ellis stayed at his station, his world reduced to the faint mechanical heartbeat coming through the headphones. He thought about the men on the surface who had no idea they were being hunted. He thought about his own family back home and the letter he had written before this patrol, the one he had folded carefully and left with the yeoman in case he did not return. In the narrow space of the control room, surrounded by the quiet efficiency of the crew, he felt both terribly alone and deeply connected to the men around him. They had trained together for this moment. They had lived in the same steel tube for weeks, sharing the same limited air and the same constant awareness that any mistake could bring depth charges raining down. Now the moment had arrived, and every man in the compartment carried his own private weight of fear and resolve. On the surface, aboard the Japanese carrier Taiho, the flagship of the mobile fleet, ordinary life continued even as the battle raged in the skies above. A young damage control sailor named Hiroshi moved through one of the lower passageways checking valves and hatches as he had been trained to do. He had heard the distant thunder of aircraft engines and the occasional vibration of heavy guns, but down here the sounds were muffled. Hiroshi had joined the Navy because he believed in serving his country, and he had been assigned to Taiho because someone had seen that he was careful and steady with his hands. He took pride in his work. The carrier was the largest and most modern ship he had ever seen, and keeping her systems ready felt like a direct contribution to the mission. He did not know that an American submarine had already begun its approach or that the next few hours would test every bit of training and courage the crew possessed. The attack came without warning. In the submarine, the captain gave the order to fire a spread of torpedoes. Ellis heard the familiar sequence of commands and then the soft, almost gentle sound of the fish leaving their tubes. Time seemed to stretch as the crew waited for the results. Some men closed their eyes. Others stared at the bulkheads as if they could see through them. When the first distant explosion reached them through the water, a low cheer went up in the control room, quickly silenced by the need to remain quiet. The captain ordered a turn away and a descent to deeper water. They had done their job. Now survival depended on how quickly and quietly they could disappear. Aboard Taiho, the first torpedo struck with a heavy, jarring impact that knocked men off their feet. Hiroshi was thrown against a bulkhead and felt a sharp pain in his shoulder, but he pushed himself up and began moving toward the sound of the damage. Alarms were sounding. Water was already pouring into one of the compartments. The carrier shuddered again as a second torpedo found its mark. Hiroshi reached the flooded area and saw other sailors already working to shore up bulkheads and control the flooding. One older petty officer was directing the effort with calm, precise orders. Hiroshi joined them without being told what to do. He passed tools, held lines, and helped move injured men out of the way. The water was rising faster than they could contain it, and the ship had begun to list. Still the men worked, because stopping meant surrendering the vessel and everyone on it. The damage to Taiho was severe but not immediately fatal. The torpedoes had opened large holes in the hull, yet the carrier's designers had built in strong compartmentalization. For a time it seemed the ship might survive. Damage control parties worked in the dark, flooded spaces with only flashlights and the sound of rushing water for company. Hiroshi stayed with his group, passing messages, and helping to move heavy timbers into place. He thought about his family and about the small apartment he had shared with his wife before shipping out. He had not written to her in several days. Now he wished he had taken the time. The thought stayed with him as he worked, a quiet anchor in the middle of the chaos. In the submarine, the crew listened for the sounds of pursuit. They had heard the distant explosions and knew at least some of the torpedoes had found targets, but they also knew the Japanese would be searching for them. Depth charges were a constant fear on every patrol. The men moved through their stations with practiced efficiency, keeping the boat as quiet as possible while the captain decided their next move. Ellis kept his headphones on, listening for the telltale sounds of approaching destroyers. The tension in the control room was thick but controlled. These were men who had trained for exactly this kind of moment. They knew that one wrong sound or one unnecessary order could bring destruction down on all of them. A second American submarine, operating nearby, had also made contact with the Japanese formation. Its crew went through the same careful approach, the same tense wait, and the same moment of firing. This boat found the carrier Shokaku. The torpedoes struck home, and the effect on the older carrier was immediate and devastating. Fires broke out in the hangar decks, and damage control parties fought to contain them while the ship continued to steam. On Shokaku, a young aviation mechanic named Sato had been working on an aircraft when the first torpedo hit. The explosion threw him across the hangar. He picked himself up, dazed but unhurt, and immediately began helping to move wounded men away from the spreading flames. Around him, other crew members were doing the same. Some carried stretchers. Others fought the fires with whatever equipment they could reach. The ship was listing and the smoke was growing thicker, but the men continued their work because the alternative was to abandon ship while wounded comrades were still aboard. The situation on Taiho took a catastrophic turn hours later. The initial torpedo damage had been serious, but the carrier might still have been saved if not for a chain of events that turned a survivable hit into a disaster. Fuel vapors from damaged tanks began to spread through the ship. Poor ventilation and the decision to keep certain hatches open to fight the flooding allowed the vapors to reach areas where they could ignite. When the explosion finally came, it was massive. The force ripped through the interior of the ship, killing many of the men who had been working below decks to save her. Hiroshi was in one of the lower compartments when the blast wave reached him. He felt the sudden pressure change and then nothing more. The ship that had seemed so strong only hours earlier was now dying from the inside out. On the second submarine, the crew heard the distant sounds of the second attack and knew they had struck another major target. They began the careful process of withdrawing, listening constantly for the approach of enemy escorts. The captain moved through the boat, speaking quietly to the men at their stations, offering a word of encouragement here and a steady presence there. These small gestures mattered in the confined space where every man could see and hear the strain on his shipmates. One young torpedo man had been visibly shaking after the firing sequence. The captain placed a hand on his shoulder and told him he had done well. The simple act of recognition helped steady the younger man. In moments like these, leadership was not about grand speeches. It was about the quiet ways one man reminded another that he was not facing the danger alone. Aboard Shokaku, the fires continued to spread despite the best efforts of the damage control parties. Sato worked alongside men he had known for months, passing buckets and helping to move heavy equipment. The heat was becoming unbearable, and the smoke made breathing difficult. He thought about his family and about the small village where he had grown up. He had joined the Navy to see more of the world and to serve something larger than himself. Now, in the middle of the chaos, he wondered whether he would ever see that village again. When the order finally came to abandon ship, Sato helped lower wounded men into the water and then went over the side himself. He swam away from the burning carrier, looking back once at the ship that had been his home for so long. Around him, other survivors were doing the same, some calling out for friends, others simply swimming in silence toward whatever rescue might come. The two submarine attacks had changed the course of the battle in ways no surface engagement could have matched. Taiho, the flagship and one of Japan's newest and most powerful carriers, was gone. Shokaku, a veteran of earlier campaigns, was also lost. The men who had fired the torpedoes would never fully know the scale of what they had accomplished, and the men who had fought to save the carriers would carry the memory of those hours for the rest of their lives. In the submarines, the crews settled into the long wait for nightfall, when they might surface and begin the careful journey back toward safer waters. Ellis removed his headphones for the first time in hours and flexed his stiff neck. He thought about the men on the surface who had died because of the sounds he had heard and reported. He felt no triumph, only a deep, quiet understanding that war at sea was often decided in moments like these, far from the main battle and by men who would never see the faces of those they had struck. The human cost inside the steel hulls was as real and as brutal as anything happening in the sky above. On the Japanese carriers, men had fought to the last to save their ships and their shipmates. They had worked in flooded compartments and burning hangars with the same courage that pilots showed in the air. On the American submarines, men had moved through their duties with a professionalism that came from long training and from the knowledge that any lapse could doom them all. These were not abstract victories or defeats. They were the result of ordinary men doing extraordinary things under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. The raw, unflinching reality of what happened inside those steel coffins, the moments of terror and courage that rarely appear in official reports, is something that deserves to be seen and understood without softening. If you want to look directly at the harsh, uncensored face of combat in the Pacific, there is a special digital collection available on Gumroad that contains raw photographs and footage from the war, material too graphic and honest to share openly on this platform. It offers a deeper, more personal connection to the men who lived and died in moments like these. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The submarines continued their careful withdrawal while the surviving Japanese ships tried to make sense of what had happened to their flagship and one of their most experienced carriers. The men who had lived through the attacks carried their memories in different ways. Some would speak of them only in quiet conversations with shipmates who had been there. Others would write letters home that tried to explain what could not be fully explained. And in the control rooms of the submarines that had fired the torpedoes, men like Ellis would carry the knowledge that a few well-placed weapons and a crew that refused to break under pressure had altered the balance of an entire battle in ways no one on the surface had expected. Aboard the flagship Taiho, a young damage control sailor named Hiroshi stood in knee-deep water in one of the lower compartments and felt the deck shift beneath his feet as another distant explosion sent a tremor through the steel around him. Realizing that the ship he had served on since her commissioning was now dying in ways no training exercise had ever prepared him to face. The torpedoes from the unseen submarine had struck hours earlier, and at first it had seemed the carrier might survive. The damage control teams had moved quickly, shoring up bulkheads and pumping out flooded spaces with the determination that came from pride in their ship and trust in one another. Hiroshi had worked alongside men he had come to know well during the long months at sea. There was the older petty officer who always carried a small photograph of his grandchildren in his pocket and showed it to anyone who asked. There was the young recruit who had joined the crew only weeks before and still jumped at every unexpected sound. They had worked together in the dim, wet spaces below decks, passing tools and encouragement as the water rose and the list grew more pronounced. Hiroshi had thought then that if they could just keep the flooding under control, the ship might limp back to safety and fight another day. But something had gone terribly wrong in the hours since the attack. Fuel vapors from ruptured tanks had spread through the ventilation system and into compartments that should have been sealed. The decision to keep certain hatches open to allow damage control parties to move more freely had allowed the dangerous gases to travel farther than anyone realized. Hiroshi had noticed the strange, sweet smell growing stronger in the air, but there had been no time to investigate. The work of saving the ship demanded every hand. He had been passing a heavy timber to two other sailors when the first internal explosion ripped through the compartment. The force threw him against the bulkhead and left him dazed, his ears ringing and his vision blurred. When he could see again, the space around him was filling with smoke and the sound of rushing water had grown louder. The petty officer who had been directing the effort was gone, lost in the blast. The young recruit was still there, coughing and trying to stand. Hiroshi helped him to his feet and together they began moving toward the ladder that led upward. Around them other survivors were doing the same, some carrying wounded shipmates, others simply trying to reach clearer air. The ship was listing more heavily now, and the deck was no longer level beneath their feet. Hiroshi thought of the letter he had written to his wife before the battle began, the one he had sealed and left in his locker with instructions that it be sent if he did not return. He had tried to sound steady in that letter, describing the pride he felt in serving aboard Taiho and the certainty that the fleet would prevail. He had not written about the fear that sometimes woke him in the middle of the night or about the way he sometimes stared at the photograph of his family and wondered if he would ever see them again. Now, as he helped the injured recruit up the ladder, those unspoken thoughts returned with a clarity that made his hands shake. On the flight deck above, the scene was one of organized chaos. Officers were trying to maintain some sense of order while damage control parties fought fires that had broken out in several places. The carrier's aircraft had been moved or jettisoned earlier in the day during the air battle, but the hangar decks below were still filled with the equipment and fuel that had sustained the air group. Those spaces were now feeding the fires that threatened to consume the ship from within. A young aviation mechanic who had been working on one of the last remaining planes before the torpedo attack was now helping to move heavy hoses across the sloping deck. He had seen friends disappear into the smoke below and had heard the screams of men trapped in flooded compartments. He kept working because stopping felt like giving up on the ship and on the men who were still fighting to save her. The situation on Taiho grew worse with every passing minute. The internal explosions had damaged the ship's ability to fight the fires and control the flooding at the same time. Power was failing in sections of the vessel, leaving damage control teams to work by flashlight and by the glow of burning material. Hiroshi and the recruit reached a passageway where a group of sailors had gathered around an injured officer. The man was conscious but clearly in pain, and the others were trying to make him comfortable while they waited for help that might not come. Hiroshi knelt beside the officer and offered him a sip of water from a canteen someone had passed forward. The officer took a small drink and then looked at the men around him. His voice was weak but steady when he spoke. He told them they had done everything that could be asked of them and that it was time to think about getting off the ship while they still could. The words carried a weight that none of them wanted to accept, but they also carried a kind of release. The fight to save Taiho was ending, and the fight to save themselves was beginning. The final explosion came without further warning. It was larger than the ones before, a massive detonation that seemed to come from deep within the carrier's hull. Hiroshi felt the deck heave upward and then drop away beneath him. He was thrown clear of the group and landed hard against a railing. When he could move again, he saw that the ship was breaking apart. Smoke and flame were pouring from openings in the deck, and the list had become so severe that standing was almost impossible. Around him men were jumping into the water or sliding down the sloping hull. Hiroshi helped the recruit over the side and then followed. The water was cold and filled with debris. He swam away from the dying carrier, looking back once at the ship that had been his home and his duty for so long. The sight of Taiho in her final moments stayed with him for the rest of his life. Farther out in the same formation, the carrier Shokaku was facing her own slow and agonizing end. The torpedoes from the second American submarine had struck earlier in the day, and the resulting fires in the hangar decks had proven impossible to fully contain. A young sailor named Sato had been working in one of those hangars when the first torpedo hit. He had been thrown across the space and had suffered burns on his arms and face, but he had stayed on his feet and begun helping to move aircraft away from the spreading flames. As the hours passed and the fires grew, Sato found himself working alongside men he barely knew, men from different divisions who had come together in the crisis. They passed buckets of water and sand, they moved heavy equipment, and they carried wounded shipmates to whatever safety could be found. The heat was intense, and the smoke made every breath a struggle, but they continued because abandoning the effort would mean abandoning the ship and everyone still aboard. Sato thought often of his family during those hours. He had a younger brother who had written to him about school and about a girl he liked in their village. Sato had kept those letters in his locker and read them when the work allowed. Now, as he fought the fires, he wondered whether his brother would ever receive the last letter Sato had started but not finished. He had wanted to tell his brother to take care of their parents and to remember that serving his country was an honor even when the cost was high. He had not written about the fear or about the way the war had begun to feel endless. Those thoughts he kept to himself, sharing them only in the quiet moments when he and a few trusted shipmates spoke of home. The order to abandon Shokaku came after it became clear that the fires could not be controlled and that the ship was in danger of capsizing. Sato helped lower several wounded men into the water using lines and then went over the side himself. The sea was filled with survivors, some swimming toward distant destroyers that were moving in to pick up as many as they could, others simply treading water and waiting. Sato stayed near a group of men from his division, helping those who were struggling and calling out to anyone who seemed to be drifting away. One older sailor had lost his grip on a piece of wreckage and was beginning to sink. Sato swam to him and helped him hold on until a small boat from a nearby destroyer reached them. The older man was barely conscious, but he managed to thank Sato before being pulled aboard. It was a small moment, the kind that happened hundreds of times that day, but it was the kind of quiet heroism that defined the final hours of the ship. As Shokaku slipped beneath the waves, the men in the water watched in silence. Some had served on her for years. Others had joined more recently. All of them felt the loss in different ways. For some it was the end of a long chapter in their lives. For others it was one more reminder of how quickly everything could change in war. Sato floated in the water and thought about the carrier that had carried him across so many miles of ocean. He thought about the friends who had not made it off the ship and about the ones who had. He thought about the letters he would write if he survived, the ones that would try to explain what had happened without adding to the worry his family already carried. The rescue boat that eventually pulled him from the water was crowded with other survivors, and they sat together in the growing darkness without speaking much. The shared experience was enough. They had lived through the death of their ship, and that was a bond that did not need words. The final hours of Taiho and Shokaku revealed in the clearest possible way the human price of carrier warfare. These were not abstract losses measured in tonnage or in strategic value. They were the deaths of ships that had been home to thousands of men, and the deaths of many of those men along with them. The crews had fought with courage and skill, but they had been asked to overcome damage that no amount of individual heroism could fully repair. The explosions that consumed Taiho from within and the fires that devoured Shokaku from her hangar decks were the result of vulnerabilities that existed in every carrier of the era. Vulnerabilities that became deadly when torpedoes found their mark and when damage control could not keep pace with the spreading catastrophe. On the American submarines that had fired the torpedoes, the crews listened to the distant sounds of the dying carriers and knew that their attacks had succeeded beyond anything they could have hoped. They did not celebrate. They simply continued the careful work of remaining undetected and moving away from the area. In the control rooms, men like the young sonar operator who had first heard the Japanese formation thought about what their actions had set in motion. They had struck a blow that would be felt across the entire battle, but they also knew that the men on those carriers had been doing their duty just as the submarine crews were doing theirs. The war at sea was often like this, decided by men who never saw each other and who would never know the full story of the lives they had touched or ended. These are the kinds of personal stories that take real dedication and many hours of careful work to bring forward, the quiet moments of courage and loss that happened far below the main battle in the sky. If these accounts of ordinary men facing the end of their ships have meant something to you, even a small tip on Ko-Fi, as little as $1, helps sustain the research and the time it takes to keep these histories alive for those who come after us. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The ocean that had carried Taiho and Shokaku across so many campaigns now received them in their final moments. The survivors who were pulled from the water would carry the memory of those hours for the rest of their lives, and the fleet that had lost two of its most important carriers would have to continue the battle without them. The death of these giants had been slow and agonizing for the men aboard, filled with the same mixture of fear, duty, and quiet resilience that had defined so much of the war at sea. In the end, it was not the steel of the ships that had failed. It was the simple, terrible truth that even the largest vessels could be brought down by the determination of a few men in a submarine and by the unforgiving physics of fire and water working together in the dark spaces below decks. A Japanese pilot who had somehow made it back to his carrier sat alone on the edge of the flight deck long after the sun had begun to set, his hand still gripping the control stick that was no longer there, staring at the empty spaces where so many of his friends' planes should have been parked and feeling a loss that went far deeper than the absence of aircraft. The afternoon's battle had ended, but the true cost was only now becoming clear as the surviving planes straggled back in ones and twos. The pilot's name was Kenji, and he had flown with the same group of men for months. They had shared meals in the ready room, traded stories about home during the long nights at sea, and looked out for one another in the sky. Now most of those faces were gone. Kenji had watched his wingman go down in flames during one of the last passes. He had seen another friend's plane simply disappear into the sea after a burst of enemy fire. He had kept flying because there had been no choice, but now that he was back on the deck, the weight of what had happened settled over him like the humid air. Around him the carrier was unnaturally quiet. The flight deck that had been a place of constant motion during the launches was nearly empty. Mechanics stood near the few aircraft that had returned, their hands moving slowly over the machines as if they could not quite believe how few there were to tend. Kenji climbed out of his cockpit and stood for a moment with his hand on the wing, feeling the heat still radiating from the engine. He did not want to walk toward the ready room. He knew what he would find there. Empty chairs. Missing names on the roster. The silence where laughter and nervous jokes had been only that morning. A senior pilot who had also returned walked past him and placed a hand briefly on Kenji's shoulder. The gesture was small, almost nothing, but it was enough to keep Kenji moving. They walked together toward the briefing space without speaking. Inside, a few other survivors sat on the benches. Some stared at the floor. One man had his head in his hands. The officer who normally led the debriefing stood at the front of the room, but he did not begin with the usual questions about enemy positions or tactics. He simply looked at the men who remained and said quietly that they had done everything that could be asked of them. Then he dismissed them. There was no point in going over the details when the outcome was already written in the empty spaces around them. Kenji returned to his quarters and sat on the edge of his bunk. He pulled out a small notebook he sometimes used to write letters home when the official mail was slow. He had started a letter to his parents earlier in the day, before the battle, but he had not finished it. Now he tried to find words for what had happened. He wrote about the sky filling with enemy fighters and about how quickly everything had turned against them. He did not write about the fear or about the faces of his friends disappearing. Those things felt too large to put on paper. Instead, he wrote that he was safe for now and that he hoped they were well. He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the notebook, unsure whether he would ever send it. On the bridge of the flagship, Admiral Ozawa stood looking out at the formation. Reports were coming in from the other carriers, and the picture they painted was worse than he had allowed himself to imagine. The losses among the air groups were catastrophic. Hundreds of aircraft had been sent out. Only a fraction had returned. More important than the numbers of planes were the men who had flown them. These were not raw recruits who could be replaced with a few weeks of training. These were the experienced pilots who had survived earlier campaigns, the ones who could teach the younger men how to stay alive in a fight, The ones who understood the feel of a carrier deck in rough seas and the way an enemy fighter moved in a turn. Ozawa had known for some time that Japan's pool of trained naval aviators was shrinking. He had argued for more time to rebuild that experience. Now the argument was over. The experience was gone, scattered across the ocean floor in the wreckage of planes that would never fly again. Ozawa thought about the young pilots he had seen that morning before they launched. Many of them had looked to the veterans for reassurance. They had asked quiet questions about what to expect and how to stay with their leaders in the confusion of battle. The veterans had answered with the calm that came from having survived before. Now those veterans were gone, and the young men who might have learned from them were gone with them. Ozawa carried the weight of that knowledge in the way he stood at the rail and the long silences between his orders. He knew that new planes could be built. Factories in Japan were still producing aircraft at a steady rate. But planes without skilled pilots to fly them were little more than targets. The real strength of a naval air arm had always been the men, not the machines. Today that strength had been broken in a way that could not be repaired quickly or easily. In one of the ready rooms on a different carrier, a young pilot who had returned with only minor damage sat with an older mechanic who had been with the squadron since the beginning. The mechanic had lost friends among the ground crews as well, men who had worked on the planes that never came back. They sat together without saying much at first. The young pilot eventually spoke about one of the missing men, a friend who had always carried a small wooden carving of a bird his sister had made for him. The mechanic nodded and said he remembered the carving. He had seen it once when the pilot had shown it during a quiet moment between flights. The conversation did not last long, but it was enough to mark the absence. These small acts of remembering were how the survivors began to carry the loss. The educational reality of what had happened was simple and devastating. Japan had entered the war with a corps of highly trained, combat-experienced naval aviators. Those men had been the backbone of every successful carrier operation in the early years. As the war continued, losses mounted and the training pipeline could not keep pace. By the time of this battle, many of the pilots being sent into combat had far less experience than their predecessors. The battle itself had accelerated the problem beyond recovery. In a single afternoon, the number of trained carrier pilots available to the Japanese fleet had been reduced by a margin that no amount of new aircraft production could offset. The men who remained would have to carry the burden of teaching the next generation while also flying missions themselves. There would be no time for the careful, deliberate training that had once produced pilots capable of operating effectively over vast distances and against determined opposition. Kenji walked the flight deck again after dark. The ship was blacked out, but he could still make out the shapes of the few planes that had survived. He stopped near one of them and placed his hand on the wing again. This time the metal was cool. He thought about all the times he had done the same thing before a mission, checking the aircraft that would carry him into danger. Now the gesture felt different. It was no longer about preparing for what was ahead. It was about acknowledging what had already been lost. He stayed there for a long time, listening to the sound of the sea against the hull and the low murmur of the ship's engines. Somewhere in the darkness other survivors were doing the same, each man alone with his thoughts but connected by the shared knowledge that the naval air arm they had known was gone. On the American side the mood was different but not without its own weight. Pilots who had flown through the afternoon's engagements gathered in ready rooms to compare notes and rest before whatever came next. Some spoke of the number of enemy planes they had seen go down. Others remained quiet, thinking about the men in those planes. One young American pilot wrote a letter to his family describing the battle without mentioning the scale of the losses on the other side. He focused instead on the relief he felt that his own squadron had come through with relatively few casualties. He did not write about the moments when he had seen parachutes in the water or when he had wondered about the lives that had ended in the smoke and fire. Those thoughts he kept to himself for now. The true cost to Japan would not be measured in the number of aircraft destroyed or even in the carriers that had been lost to submarine attack. It would be measured in the years of accumulated skill and experience that had vanished in a single day. Those pilots had represented the institutional memory of Japanese naval aviation. They had known how to find a carrier in bad weather, how to coordinate attacks with other squadrons, how to bring damaged planes back to a moving deck. That knowledge had died with them. The men who would replace them would have to learn those lessons the hard way, under fire, with far less margin for error. The balance of power in the Pacific skies had shifted in ways that no new construction program could reverse. Kenji eventually returned to his quarters and lay down on his bunk without undressing. He stared at the overhead and thought about the letter he had started. He decided he would finish it in the morning, when the words might come more easily. For now he simply lay in the dark and listened to the ship around him. The carrier was still moving, still part of a fleet that had to continue its mission despite the losses. Kenji understood that. He also understood that the fleet he was part of would never again be able to put the same kind of air power into the sky. The irreplaceable part of that power had been lost over the course of one long afternoon, scattered across the same ocean that had carried them all to this place. The stories of these men and the experience that disappeared with them are the kind of human truths that deserve more than a single telling. They benefit from longer conversations, from unfiltered looks at what was lost and why it mattered, and from the chance to sit with the weight of it alongside others who care about preserving these moments. Our Patreon community exists for exactly that purpose. There you can access free podcasts that go deeper into these events, raw and unblurred video sections that show the reality behind the summaries, and join a group of fellow history lovers who want to explore these stories together. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The carriers continued their slow movement through the night. On their decks and in their passageways, the survivors carried the loss in different ways. Some would speak of it only among themselves. Others would write letters that tried to capture what could not be fully captured. All of them understood that the naval air arm that had once ruled the skies of the Pacific had been shattered in a way that could not be undone by courage or determination alone. The machines could be replaced. The men who had known how to fly them in the face of overwhelming odds could not. That understanding would shape every decision the Japanese fleet made in the days and weeks ahead, and it would echo long after the battle itself had passed into history. In the quiet of his cabin aboard the heavy cruiser Indianapolis, Admiral Raymond Spruance stood over the chart table with the weight of thousands of lives pressing down on him and felt the same steady calm that had carried him through earlier crises settle into something deeper. Something closer to the private reckoning that comes when every choice carries consequences no one else can fully share. The reports had been coming in steadily through the afternoon and into the evening. The Japanese fleet was in retreat, its carriers damaged or destroyed, its air groups shattered beyond recovery. The American pilots who had flown through the long hours of the turkey shoot were exhausted but triumphant, and many of his staff officers were already speaking of the opportunity that now lay open. If the American task force turned west and pursued aggressively through the night, they might catch the remnants of the Japanese mobile fleet and finish what the afternoon's fighting had begun. The lure was powerful. Total victory at sea had a clarity to it that protecting a beachhead did not. Yet Spruance kept returning to the same set of facts that had shaped every decision since the invasion of Saipan had begun. He thought of the thousands of Marines and soldiers who had gone ashore and were still fighting to secure the island. They depended on the carriers and the gunfire support ships that remained close by. A night pursuit would take those ships far from the invasion area, leaving the beachhead vulnerable to any Japanese surface forces that might still be in the vicinity or to air attacks launched from islands that had not yet been neutralized. Spruance had seen what happened when fleets chased decisive battles at the expense of the mission they were meant to support. He had lived through the hard lessons of earlier campaigns where bold strokes had sometimes left other forces exposed. The chess player in him understood that the board still held pieces that could punish an overextension. A staff officer entered with the latest position reports. Spruance listened without interrupting, asked two quiet questions about fuel states and the condition of the escorting destroyers, then nodded and returned to the chart. He did not raise his voice or pace the cabin. Those who knew him well had learned that his greatest intensity showed itself in stillness. When the officer left, Spruance remained standing for a long time, one hand resting on the edge of the table. He thought about the young pilots who had flown so many missions that day, the sailors who had worked the decks through the heat and the danger, and the Marines who were counting on the fleet to stay within reach. He also thought about the Japanese commanders who were now trying to extract what remained of their force. He did not hate them. He respected the duty that drove them, even as he worked to defeat it. That respect made the decision harder rather than easier, because he understood that the men on the other side were also carrying the weight of lives entrusted to them. Earlier in the day he had spoken with Admiral Mitcher, whose carriers had borne the brunt of the fighting. Mitcher had advocated for a more aggressive pursuit once the extent of the Japanese losses became clear. The aviator in Mitcher wanted to finish the job while the enemy was disorganized and vulnerable. Spruance had listened carefully, as he always did when his commanders spoke from experience. He valued Mitcher's judgment. He knew the pilots trusted their commander and would follow him anywhere. Yet Spruance also knew that the overall responsibility for the success of the entire operation rested with him. The invasion of Saipan was not merely a supporting action for a carrier battle. It was the central objective, the step that would place long-range bombers within reach of Japan itself. If that objective was placed at risk to chase a retreating fleet, then the larger purpose of the campaign could be compromised. Spruance had faced similar moments before. At Midway he had made decisions that balanced risk and mission, and the outcome had vindicated his judgment. But he had also seen how victory could breed a dangerous confidence, how the desire to press an advantage could sometimes blind commanders to the dangers that remained. He did not want to repeat the mistakes of others who had allowed the pursuit of glory to override the protection of the forces they were meant to shield. In the quiet of the cabin he allowed himself to imagine the faces of the men on the beach who were still under fire, the sailors on the transports who were waiting for the carriers to keep the skies clear. The pilots who had already given so much and would be asked to give more if the pursuit continued. These were not abstractions. They were the human reality behind every line on the chart. He called a small group of his closest advisors together. They gathered around the table in the dim light, the sea moving steadily beneath the hull. One officer laid out the arguments for pursuit with clear conviction. Another spoke of the risks to the invasion force and the condition of the American ships after a day of intense operations. Spruance listened to each man without interrupting. He asked questions that revealed he had already considered most of the points being raised. When the discussion reached its natural pause, he spoke in the same measured tone he used in every briefing. The fleet would remain close to Saipan. The Japanese had been dealt a crippling blow. The primary mission remained the security of the beachhead and the continued support of the troops ashore. A night chase carried too many uncertainties and too great a chance of leaving the invasion exposed. The decision was made. The reaction among some of his staff was disappointment that could not be entirely hidden. They had seen the damage inflicted on the Japanese and believed the moment was ripe for a decisive finish. Spruance understood their frustration. He had felt the same pull toward total victory. Yet he also understood that the measure of command was not the boldness of any single action but the steady protection of the larger objective. He dismissed the group with a quiet word of thanks for their counsel. Then he remained alone with the charts once more. In the hours that followed, reports continued to arrive. The Japanese fleet was indeed withdrawing, its remaining carriers limping westward under cover of darkness. American search planes confirmed the direction and the reduced strength of the enemy force. Spruance received each report with the same outward calm. He did not second-guess the decision he had made. He had weighed the lives of the men on the beach against the possibility of destroying more Japanese ships, and he had chosen the course that protected the mission he had been given. That choice carried its own cost. He knew that some would later question whether greater aggression might have ended the Japanese carrier threat even sooner. He accepted that judgment would come. Commanders who made difficult choices always faced second-guessing from those who did not carry the full responsibility. Spruance thought about the letters he sometimes received from families of men who had served under him in earlier battles. He thought about the quiet pride he felt when a young officer performed well under pressure and the heavier burden when losses occurred. Those personal threads ran through every strategic decision, even when they could not be spoken aloud in a staff meeting. He had learned long ago that the sea did not reward sentiment, but it also did not forgive commanders who forgot that the pieces on the chessboard were living men with families waiting for them. The restraint he had chosen was not born of caution alone. It was born of a clear-eyed understanding that the invasion of Saipan represented something larger than the destruction of any single enemy fleet. Securing the Marianas would change the reach of the war itself. Protecting that achievement mattered more than the satisfaction of a more complete naval victory. A young American pilot named Tom stood on the flight deck of his carrier with one hand resting on the wing of his Hellcat, listening to the briefing officer describe a target that lay at the extreme edge of what any of them could reach and still hope to return, and he felt the same mixture of resolve and quiet dread that had been building since the reports of the Japanese retreat had arrived the night before. The decision had come down from the flag bridge in the early hours. After the devastating losses inflicted on the Japanese air groups the previous day, the enemy fleet was withdrawing westward. American search planes had located the remnants, and the opportunity to strike a crippling blow while they were still vulnerable was too significant to ignore. Yet the distance was daunting. The Japanese carriers were hundreds of miles away, far beyond the normal operating range of the American strike aircraft. To reach them and still have enough fuel to fight and return would require every pilot to fly with absolute precision, conserve every drop of fuel, and accept that many planes might not make it back to the carriers at all. Some would have to ditch in the sea. Others might reach the task force after dark and face the dangerous prospect of night landings on pitching decks. The gamble was enormous, but so was the potential reward. If the strike succeeded, the Japanese naval air arm might be finished for good. Tom had listened to the briefing with the same steady attention he gave every mission. He had flown through the long hours of the turkey shoot the day before, watching Japanese planes fall in numbers that still seemed unreal. Now he was being asked to fly even farther, to push his aircraft and himself to the limit in pursuit of an enemy that was already beaten but not yet destroyed. Around him in the ready room other pilots sat with the same mixture of focus and private calculation. Some checked their maps one more time. Others wrote quick notes to be left behind in case they did not return. Tom thought about the letter he had started the previous evening and never finished. It was still in his locker, folded but incomplete. He had wanted to tell his family about the battle without worrying them, to sound confident and steady the way he knew they needed him to be. Now there was no time to finish it. He would have to carry the words in his head instead. As the pilots prepared to man their planes, small acts of ordinary kindness continued amid the tension. One veteran pilot paused beside a younger man who was checking his parachute harness for the third time and offered a quiet word of reassurance. Another shared the last of his coffee with a squadron mate whose hands were shaking slightly from lack of sleep. These were not grand gestures. They were the quiet ways men reminded one another that they were not alone in the risk they were about to take. Tom accepted a spare pair of gloves from his wingman without comment. The wingman simply nodded and moved on. In moments like these, words were often unnecessary. The shared understanding of what lay ahead was enough. Tom climbed into his cockpit and went through the familiar checks with methodical care. The engine roared to life beneath him, the familiar vibration traveling through the airframe and into his bones. He looked out across the deck at the other planes preparing to launch. The formation would be large, the largest strike the task force had yet sent out in this battle. Every available aircraft that could carry a bomb or torpedo and still have a chance of making the round trip was being committed. The deck crews moved with their usual efficiency, but there was an extra layer of tension in their movements. They knew the risks as well as the pilots did. When the signal came to launch, Tom advanced the throttle and felt the familiar push of acceleration as his Hellcat rolled down the deck and lifted into the morning sky. The climb to altitude was long and steady. Tom kept his eyes on his instruments and on the formation around him. The ocean stretched endlessly below, a vast blue emptiness that offered no landmarks and no mercy. He thought about the distance they had to cover and the even greater distance they would have to cover on the way back. The calculations had been tight in the briefing. Every gallon of fuel mattered. Every unnecessary turn or climb would cost precious minutes and miles. Tom flew with the same disciplined precision he had used the day before, but now there was an added weight. Yesterday they had fought close to the fleet, with the safety of their carriers never far away. Today they were flying into the unknown, toward an enemy that might still have teeth even in retreat. In the cockpits around him, other pilots were carrying their own private burdens. One man thought about the wife who was waiting back home and the child he had never seen. Another thought about the friends who had not returned from the previous day's fighting and wondered whether today would be his turn. They did not speak of these things over the radio. The discipline of the formation held. Yet the knowledge of what they were risking traveled with them across the empty miles. Tom glanced at his fuel gauge more than once during the long outbound leg. The needle was moving exactly as the planners had predicted, but the sight of it still tightened something in his chest. He adjusted his course slightly to take advantage of the wind and conserve every possible drop. Around him the formation held steady, a long line of aircraft stretching across the sky toward a target that existed only on their maps and in their briefings. The approach to the target area brought a new layer of tension. Search planes had reported the position of the Japanese fleet, but the ocean was large and the enemy was moving. Tom scanned the horizon constantly, looking for the thin white lines of wakes or the dark shapes of carriers. When the first contact reports came over the radio, a ripple of focused energy moved through the formation. The Japanese fleet was there, below and ahead, its remaining carriers and escorts spread across the water in a defensive array. The American strike group began its descent, the pilots pushing their aircraft into the attack profile they had practiced so many times. Tom felt the familiar shift in his stomach as the nose came down. The long flight was over. The gamble was about to be tested in the most direct way possible. The attack itself unfolded in a blur of speed and violence. Dive bombers plummeted toward the Japanese carriers while torpedo planes skimmed low over the water. Anti-aircraft fire rose to meet them in dense black bursts. Tom stayed with his section, covering the bombers as they pressed their attacks and then turning to engage any enemy fighters that appeared. The Japanese resistance was determined but disorganized compared to the coordinated defense they had faced the day before. Many of their best pilots were already gone. The remaining defenders fought with courage, but they could not match the numbers or the coordination of the American strike. Tom saw one Japanese carrier take multiple hits, smoke and flame rising from its deck. He saw another begin to list as torpedoes found their mark. The satisfaction of striking back was real, but it was tempered by the constant awareness of his fuel gauge and the long distance still ahead. As the strike group turned for home, the true cost of the gamble began to reveal itself. Some planes were already low on fuel. Others had taken damage that affected their performance. Tom checked his own gauges and made the mental calculations he had been trained to perform. He had enough to reach the task force if everything went perfectly. Any delay, any headwind stronger than expected, any need to orbit while waiting for a landing slot would change the equation. Around him other pilots were making the same calculations. The radio discipline held, but the tension was audible in the clipped exchanges. One pilot reported that he was running critically low and might have to ditch. Another asked for a vector to the nearest carrier. The formation began to spread as individual aircraft sought the most efficient path home. Tom flew on, conserving every ounce of power and altitude. He thought about the young pilot who had sat beside him in the ready room that morning and wondered whether that man was still in the air or already in the water. He thought about the deck crews waiting back on the carriers, the men who would have to turn the task force into the wind and light every available lamp if the returning planes arrived after dark. The gamble had always carried this risk. The reward of striking the Japanese fleet hard enough to finish the battle had been balanced against the possibility that many American pilots would pay with their lives or their freedom. Tom kept his eyes on the horizon and his mind on the next mile, the next adjustment, the next small decision that might mean the difference between reaching home and disappearing into the vast Pacific. The first carriers appeared as tiny shapes on the horizon, and a wave of relief moved through the formation. Tom's fuel was lower than he liked, but it was enough. He joined the landing pattern, watching the deck rise and fall with the swells and timing his approach with the same care he had used on every mission. When his wheels finally touched the deck and the arresting wire caught, he felt the familiar jolt and then the sudden stillness as the plane came to a stop. He sat in the cockpit for a moment longer than usual, letting the tension drain from his shoulders. Around him other planes were landing or circling, some with fuel gauges on empty, others already dark from damage. The gamble had succeeded in its primary purpose. The Japanese fleet had been struck again, its remaining carriers further crippled. But the cost had been real. Some pilots would not return. Others would spend the night in the water waiting for rescue. The long reach of American carrier air power had been proven once more, but it had also been shown to have limits that no amount of courage could fully overcome. Tom climbed out of his cockpit and stood for a moment on the deck, the salt air cool against his face. Other pilots were doing the same, some shaking hands, others simply standing in silence as the reality of what they had done and what they had risked settled over them. The mission had been a success by the measure of damage inflicted on the enemy. It had also been a reminder that in carrier warfare, every victory carried its own price in fuel, in aircraft, and in the lives of the men who flew them. Tom thought about the unfinished letter in his locker and decided he would finish it that evening, if only to put into words the mixture of pride and relief he felt at having come home. The gamble had reached farther than any previous strike in the battle. It had also brought the American pilots face to face with the hard truth that even the longest reach had its breaking point. These are the kinds of stories of courage, risk, and quiet sacrifice in the Pacific that deserve to be seen and remembered in powerful ways. If the bravery of these pilots and the high-stakes gamble they undertook has stayed with you, there is a film called Midway that captures the heart of carrier battles with respect and intensity, and it is available to stream right now on Prime Video. Or if you prefer something tangible to hold on to, our trusted partners on Amazon offer some truly remarkable WW2 memorabilia that lets you connect with that history in a personal way. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The task force turned back toward Saipan as darkness fell. The pilots who had flown the long strike rested where they could, some writing letters, others simply sitting in the ready rooms and letting the day's events settle. The gamble had changed the balance of the battle once more. The Japanese fleet was now in full retreat, its remaining strength too diminished to mount another serious challenge. Yet the men who had flown the strike knew better than anyone that such victories came at a cost that could never be measured only in ships sunk or planes destroyed. They carried that knowledge in the way they moved through the ship that night, and the quiet conversations they shared with those who had stayed behind, and in the private thoughts they kept to themselves as the carriers steamed eastward under the cover of darkness. The long reach had held. The gamble had paid off. But the ocean remained vast, and the war was far from over. A young American dive bomber pilot named Tom pushed his aircraft into a steep dive toward the Japanese carrier below, the wind screaming past the canopy as tracers from the ship's guns streaked upward like deadly fireworks, and he felt the same focused calm that had carried him through the long flight settle into something sharper as the target filled his sights. The strike group had arrived after the exhausting journey across hundreds of miles of open ocean. Fatigue sat heavy in every pilot's bones, yet the sight of the Japanese fleet spread out below them brought a surge of renewed purpose. The enemy carriers were still there, damaged from the previous day but not yet finished. Tom's section had been assigned to one of the larger vessels, a ship that intelligence and visual confirmation marked as a prime target. He could see the wakes of escorting destroyers weaving protective patterns and the dark shapes of aircraft on the flight deck. The Japanese were ready for them. Black puffs of anti-aircraft fire already dotted the sky ahead. Tom adjusted his dive angle slightly, keeping his eyes on the carrier while his hands made the small corrections that would decide whether his bombs found their mark or fell harmlessly into the sea. Around him other pilots were making their own runs. Some came in low for torpedo attacks, skimming the wave tops while gunners on the Japanese ships poured fire into their path. Others followed Tom's path from higher altitude, releasing their bombs in the final seconds before pulling out of the dive. The sky was filled with the sound of engines and the sharp cracks of exploding shells. Tom felt the aircraft shudder as a near miss rocked it, but he held the dive steady. In those last moments before release, time seemed to slow. He thought of the men on the carrier below, men who were fighting for their ship with the same determination he felt. He thought of the friends who had not returned from the turkey shoot the day before. Then he released the bombs and pulled back on the stick, the force of the recovery pressing him hard into his seat as the Hellcat climbed away from the target. On the Japanese carrier Hyo, the first warning had come from lookouts who spotted the incoming American formation. The ship's crew had been working through the night to repair damage from earlier actions and to prepare for whatever might come next. A young damage control sailor named Hiroshi was below decks when the alarm sounded. He had spent the previous hours helping to shore up weakened bulkheads and move supplies to where they might be needed most. When the call came to battle stations, he moved quickly to his assigned position near one of the ship's vital compartments. Around him other sailors were doing the same, their faces showing the strain of too little sleep and too much tension. Hiroshi thought briefly of the letter he had written to his family before the fleet sortied, the one that spoke of duty and the hope that the coming battle would bring honor to Japan. He had not mentioned his private fears or the way he sometimes stared at the photograph of his wife and wondered if he would ever see her again. Now there was no time for such thoughts. The ship was under attack, and every man had a job to do. The first bomb struck near the stern, sending shock waves through the hull. Hiroshi felt the deck jump beneath his feet and heard the roar of the explosions even through the thick steel around him. Water began to spray from a ruptured pipe, and he moved instinctively to help contain the flooding. Other men joined him, passing tools and shouting instructions over the noise. The ship was already listing slightly from earlier damage, and the new hits made the angle steeper. Hiroshi worked in the growing darkness as power flickered and failed in sections of the vessel. He could hear the distant thunder of more explosions above and the sharper sounds of anti-aircraft guns firing back at the attackers. In the middle of the chaos, one of the older sailors beside him paused long enough to pass a canteen of water. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of shared endurance. Hiroshi took a quick drink and handed the canteen back, then returned to the work of trying to save the ship. Tom leveled off after his pullout and banked to assess the damage. Smoke was rising from the carrier, and he could see at least one fire burning on the flight deck. Other planes from his group were still making their runs, some taking heavy fire as they pressed in close. He spotted his wingman struggling with a damaged aircraft and moved to cover him, staying between the stricken plane and the worst of the anti-aircraft bursts. The wingman's voice came over the radio, steady but strained, reporting that he had taken hits but could still fly. Tom stayed with him as they climbed away from the target area, watching for any Japanese fighters that might have survived the previous day's losses. The sky seemed strangely empty of enemy planes compared to the day before. The Japanese air defense was now almost entirely in the hands of the ships themselves, and while the gunners were determined, they could not match the coordinated defense the American task force had enjoyed. On Hyo, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The combination of bomb and torpedo hits had started multiple fires that the damage control teams could not fully contain. Hiroshi and the men around him worked in increasingly difficult conditions as smoke filled the lower decks and the list grew more pronounced. They passed buckets and used whatever tools came to hand to shore up failing bulkheads. An officer moved through the space, directing efforts and offering quiet encouragement to the exhausted sailors. When one man collapsed from the heat and smoke, two others carried him toward a ladder leading upward. Hiroshi stayed at his post, knowing that if the flooding reached the engine rooms or the magazines, the ship could be lost in minutes. He thought of his family again, not in the abstract way of earlier letters, but with a sharp clarity that came from knowing how close the end might be. The photograph he carried in his pocket felt heavier than it should. He touched it once through the fabric of his uniform, then turned back to the work. Tom and his wingmen were heading back toward the task force when they saw another section of American planes making a coordinated attack on a second Japanese vessel. The sight gave him a grim satisfaction. The gamble of the long-range strike was paying off in damage inflicted, even if the cost in fuel and aircraft was high. He checked his own gauges and made the mental calculations that every pilot was performing. The return flight would be tight. Some planes would not make it. He had already seen one Hellcat ditch earlier, the pilot disappearing into the waves as the formation continued onward. Tom kept his aircraft steady, conserving fuel and altitude, and stayed close to his wingman. The two men had flown together through the Turkey Shoot and now through this longer mission. The bond between them was unspoken but real, the kind that formed when men faced the same dangers and relied on each other to survive. On Hio, the fires had spread beyond the ability of the remaining damage control parties to fight them. Hiroshi received the order to abandon the compartment and make his way to the flight deck. He helped two wounded sailors up the ladder, then followed them into the open air. The scene above was one of controlled desperation. The ship was burning in several places, and the list had become severe enough that walking required effort. Officers were directing the evacuation, helping men into the water or onto rafts. Hiroshi moved to assist where he could, passing life jackets and helping lower injured crew members over the side. The sea around the ship was already filling with survivors. Some swam toward nearby destroyers that were moving in to rescue them. Others clung to floating debris. Hiroshi stayed on the deck until the last possible moment, helping one more man who had become trapped by a fallen beam. When the beam was finally moved, the two of them went over the side together. The water was cold and filled with oil and debris. Hiroshi swam away from the burning carrier, looking back once at the ship that had been his home and his duty. Flames were visible through the smoke, and the list had grown so steep that the flight deck was almost vertical. He turned away and focused on staying afloat. Tom saw the carrier begin its final plunge from several miles away. The ship rolled slowly onto its side and then slipped beneath the waves, leaving only a spreading patch of oil and debris on the surface. He felt no triumph in the sight. He had seen too much destruction in the past 2 days to feel anything but a heavy sense of what the cost had been on both sides. The Japanese sailors who had fought to save their ship had shown the same courage and determination as the American pilots who had attacked it. The difference lay in the outcome, not in the quality of the men involved. Tom turned his attention back to the flight home. The task force was still far away, and the sun was already low on the horizon. The gamble of the long strike had succeeded in its immediate purpose. The Japanese fleet had been struck again, its remaining strength further reduced. But the return journey would test every pilot who had survived the attack. The assault continued against other Japanese ships as the strike group pressed its advantage. Torpedo planes made runs on a cruiser that had been screening the carriers, scoring hits that left the vessel dead in the water. Dive bombers targeted another carrier that was already damaged from the previous day, adding to the fires and flooding that threatened to finish her. Throughout the action, American pilots showed individual gallantry that went beyond simple duty. One pilot whose aircraft was badly damaged stayed in the fight long enough to draw enemy fire away from a squadron mate making his bombing run. Another landed his stricken plane on a carrier deck with almost no fuel remaining, the aircraft coming to a stop just short of the barrier. These were not stories that appeared in official reports. They were the quiet acts of courage that happened in the middle of chaos and were remembered only by those who had been there. On the Japanese side, the crews of the surviving ships fought with the same desperate resolve. Aboard one of the remaining carriers, sailors worked through the smoke and heat to move ammunition away from spreading fires and to treat the wounded who could not be evacuated. Small moments of kindness continued even as the situation grew more desperate. One man shared the last of his water with a shipmate who was too weak to reach it himself. Another carried a wounded friend to a place of relative safety before returning to his post. These acts did not change the outcome of the battle, but they revealed the human core that remained even when everything around them was falling apart. Tom and the other surviving pilots continued their journey back to the task force as darkness began to fall. The long gamble had reached its conclusion. The Japanese fleet had been struck hard from the clouds, its carriers sunk or crippled, and its ability to contest the skies of the Pacific broken beyond repair. Yet the cost had been paid in the lives of men on both sides, and the ships that would never sail again, and in the quiet understanding that even victory carried its own measure of loss. Tom thought about the unfinished letter in his locker and decided that when he finally reached his carrier, he would finish it. He would write about the attack and about the men he had seen fighting and dying on both sides. He would not try to make it sound heroic. He would simply try to tell the truth of what had happened when fire came from the clouds and the ocean received the ships and the men who had sailed in them. The raw, unflinching truth of what happened in those moments, the courage under fire, the terror of ships breaking apart, the small acts of humanity amid the destruction, is something that demands to be seen without softening or distance. A special digital collection on Gumroad offers unseen, raw photographs and footage from the Pacific War, material too graphic and honest to share openly on this platform. It provides an unflinching look at the harsh realities these men faced on both sides of the battle. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The task force continued its movement through the gathering darkness. The pilots who had flown the attack rested where they could, some speaking quietly of what they had seen, others sitting in silence as the events of the day settled over them. The Japanese fleet, what remained of it, was now in full retreat, its surviving ships limping westward with heavy damage and heavy losses. The battle that had begun with such ferocity 2 days earlier was drawing to its conclusion. The American pilots had struck from the clouds with skill and determination, and the Japanese crews had fought to the last to save their ships and their comrades. In the end, the ocean that had carried both fleets across thousands of miles claimed the vessels that could no longer stay afloat and the men who had gone down with them. The stories of those final hours would be told and retold by the survivors, each man carrying his own memories of courage and loss into whatever future the war still held for him. In the pitch black over the empty Pacific, a young Hellcat pilot named Tom stared at the fuel gauge as the needle crept steadily toward the red line and felt the first cold certainty that he might not reach the carrier deck he had left so many hours earlier. The strike had been a success by every measure that mattered. The Japanese fleet had been hit hard again, its remaining carriers further crippled and its ability to mount any serious counterattack broken. But the price of that success was now revealing itself in the most personal way possible. The long outbound leg had consumed more fuel than the planners had hoped. The intense fighting over the target had burned still more. Now, as darkness swallowed the ocean below and the task force remained hundreds of miles away, every pilot in the returning formation was performing the same silent calculation. How much longer could they stay airborne? How much could they afford to lose in a turn or a climb? And what would happen if the carriers were not where they expected them to be when they finally arrived? Tom kept his eyes moving between the instruments and the dark horizon. His wingman was still with him, though the other man's radio calls had grown shorter and more clipped as the fuel situation worsened. They had flown together through the turkey shoot the day before and through the long strike today. The bond between them had never needed many words, but now even those few exchanges felt precious. Tom thought about the letter he had started the night before and still had not finished. He thought about his family waiting back home and about the friends who had already been lost in the battle. He did not allow himself to dwell on any of it for long. The only thing that mattered now was flying the airplane, conserving every possible drop of fuel, and believing that the task force would be there when they needed it. On the carriers themselves, the atmosphere had shifted from the controlled tension of the launch to something closer to quiet dread. Admiral Mitcher stood on the bridge of his flagship, receiving reports from the returning strike group and from the search planes that had been sent out to guide them home. The news was not good. Many of the pilots were critically low on fuel. Some had already ditched. Others were reporting that they might not reach the task force at all. The carriers had turned into the wind as soon as the first stragglers appeared on radar, but the distance was still too great for some of the aircraft. Mitcher listened to each report with the same outward calm that had defined his command throughout the battle. Inside, he was weighing the same terrible choice that had faced every carrier admiral who had ever sent his pilots into danger. If he kept the task force dark, the returning planes might never find the carriers in the blackness. The risk of a submarine attack if he turned on every light was real and serious. Japanese submarines were known to be in the area, and a brightly lit formation would present an easy target. Yet the alternative was to leave his pilots out there in the dark with nowhere to land and no way to know where safety lay. Mitcher had spent his career in naval aviation. He knew what it felt like to be low on fuel over a black ocean with the carrier somewhere ahead but invisible. He knew the courage it took to keep flying when every instinct said the situation was hopeless. He also knew that the men in those cockpits were not abstractions. They were the same young pilots who had flown through the turkey shoot the day before, who had written letters home, who had shared quiet jokes in the ready rooms before launching into danger. The decision was not about tactics alone. It was about the lives of those men. Mitcher gave the order without further debate. Turn on every light. Every searchlight, every running light, every lamp on every ship in the task force. The formation that had been operating under strict blackout for days suddenly blazed like a city at sea. On the carriers, deck crews worked frantically to prepare for night landings. Arresting wires were checked and rechecked. Barriers were raised. Medical teams stood ready. On the bridges of the escorting destroyers and cruisers, lookouts scanned the darkness for any sign of a periscope or torpedo wake. The risk was accepted. The pilots came first. Tom saw the lights before he heard the radio call. At first he thought it might be a trick of exhaustion, a false hope born from staring too long into the dark. Then the radio crackled with the voice of the fighter director, calm and steady, giving the bearing and distance to the task force. The lights were real. The carriers were there. A wave of relief moved through him so strong that his hands shook on the stick for a moment before he steadied them. He called to his wingman, telling him the news, and heard the same relief in the other man's voice. They were not out of danger yet. The fuel was still critically low, and night carrier landings were dangerous even in the best conditions. But they had a chance now. The lights had given them that chance. Around Tom, other pilots were making the same discovery. Some called out over the radio with the first real hope they had felt in hours. Others simply flew toward the glow on the horizon, conserving what little fuel remained. One pilot whose engine had been running rough since the attack reported that he might not make it to the deck. Another, already low and descending, asked for a vector to the nearest carrier. The fighter directors worked without pause, vectoring planes to the ships that could take them and coordinating with the deck crews who were preparing for the chaos of a night recovery. The task force had become a beacon in the darkness, and every pilot still in the air was flying toward it with the last reserves of skill and determination they possessed. On one of the carriers, a deck officer named Lieutenant Graves stood near the landing signal officer and watched the first returning planes appear in the glow of the lights. He had been through night recoveries before, but never under circumstances like these. The pilots were exhausted. Their aircraft were damaged or critically low on fuel. Some would be making their first night landing in combat conditions. Graves had seen men die on the deck during daylight recoveries. He knew how much more dangerous the situation became when visibility was limited and fatigue was high. Yet he also knew that every light burning on the ship represented a decision that had been made to save lives rather than to protect the formation. He stayed at his post, calling instructions and watching the approaches, and he thought about the young pilots who were depending on the steady hands and clear voices of the men on the deck to bring them home. Tom approached the carrier with his fuel gauge showing almost nothing. He had been vectored to the nearest deck, and the landing signal officer was already visible in the lights. The sea was moving beneath the ship, the deck rising and falling with the swells. Tom made his approach with the same care he had used on every landing since flight school, but now every movement felt magnified by exhaustion and the knowledge of how little margin remained. The hook caught the wire on the first try. The plane jerked to a stop, and Tom sat in the cockpit for a moment longer than usual, letting the tension drain from his shoulders. Around him, other planes were landing or circling, some coming in too fast, others touching down and then bouncing back into the air before catching a wire. The deck was alive with motion and shouted orders. Medical teams were already moving toward one plane whose pilot had collapsed after climbing out. The cost of the long strike was being tallied in real time. Not every pilot made it to the deck. One Hellcat ran out of fuel just short of the task force and ditched in the darkness. The pilot managed to get out of the sinking aircraft and inflate his raft, but he was alone in the black water with no way to signal his position. Another pilot, his engine failing, attempted a landing on a carrier that was not expecting him and crashed into the barrier. He survived, but the aircraft was destroyed and the deck was temporarily fouled. On the bridges of the carriers, officers tracked each plane that made it aboard and each one that did not. Mitchell received the reports without visible reaction, but those closest to him saw the way his shoulders tightened with every loss. The lights had saved many lives. They had not saved all of them. The decision had been the right one, but it had not been without cost. In the ready rooms after the last planes had landed or been accounted for, the survivors gathered in small groups. Some spoke quietly about the attack and the long return. Others sat in silence, still processing what they had been through. Tom found his wingman and the two men shared a brief nod that carried more than words could have expressed. They had made it back. Others had not. The bond between them had been tested and held. Around the room, small acts of ordinary kindness continued. One pilot offered his seat to a man who looked ready to collapse. Another passed a cup of coffee to a friend whose hands were still shaking. These were not grand gestures. They were the quiet ways men reminded one another that they had survived together and that the cost had been shared. Mitchell remained on the bridge for a long time after the recovery was complete. He reviewed the reports of losses and successes, spoke with his staff about the condition of the task force, and made the decisions that would shape the next hours. The lights had been turned off once the last planes were down, the formation returning to blackout conditions. The risk of submarine attack remained, but the immediate crisis had passed. Mitchell thought about the pilots who had flown through the darkness and found the lights he had ordered turned on. He thought about the ones who had not made it. He carried both in the same steady way he had carried every other burden of command throughout the battle. The decision had been his to make, and he had made it knowing the risks on both sides. The men who had returned would fly again. The men who had not would be remembered by the ones who had known them. Tom sat on the edge of his bunk later that night and finally finished the letter he had started days earlier. He wrote about the long strike and the attack on the Japanese fleet. He wrote about the darkness and the lights that had appeared when all hope seemed gone. He did not try to make it sound heroic or to hide the fear he had felt when the fuel gauge dropped. He simply told the truth of what had happened as best he could. When he was finished, he folded the letter and placed it with the others he had written during the battle. He did not know when they would be mailed or whether they would reach home before he did. He only knew that writing them had helped him carry the weight of the day a little more easily. The task force continued its movement through the night. The pilots who had survived the darkest return rested where they could. Some would fly again in the days ahead. Others would carry the memory of that night for the rest of their lives. Mitcher's decision to turn on the lights had saved many of them. It had also revealed the kind of leadership that understood the difference between protecting a formation and protecting the men who served in it. The gamble of the long strike had reached its conclusion in the darkness. The courage of the pilots who flew it and the courage of the admiral who lit the way home had ensured that most of them lived to tell the story. The ocean that had almost claimed them remained vast and indifferent, but the lights had burned long enough for many to find their way back. These are the kinds of personal stories of courage under impossible pressure and quiet leadership that take real dedication and countless hours of careful work to bring forward and preserve. If these accounts of the darkest return and the lights that saved so many have stayed with you, even a small tip on Ko-Fi, as little as $1, helps sustain the research and the time it takes to keep these histories alive for those who come after us. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The carriers steamed on through the darkness, their decks quiet now except for the men who still stood watch. The battle that had begun with such ferocity days earlier was drawing to its close. The Japanese fleet was in retreat, its air arms shattered and its carriers sunk or crippled. The American task force had paid its own price in aircraft and in the lives of pilots who had not made it back. But the men who had flown through the night and found the lights Mitcher ordered turned on carried with them the knowledge that they had been worth saving. That knowledge would stay with them long after the battle was over, long after the ships had returned to port and the letters had been mailed and the stories had begun to be told. In the end, it was not the lights themselves that mattered most. It was the decision behind them, the understanding that sometimes the greatest courage a commander can show is the willingness to accept risk in order to bring his men home. In the quiet hours after the last plane had landed and the lights had been doused once more, a young American pilot named Tom stood on the flight deck of his carrier and looked out over the dark ocean, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle into his bones in a way that no amount of exhaustion could fully explain. The battle was over. The Japanese fleet had turned westward and was now limping away with its remaining strength broken beyond repair. The American task force had held its position near Saipan, protecting the invasion force and securing the gains that had been fought for so fiercely over the past 3 days. Yet in the stillness that followed the roar of engines and the thunder of guns, the true cost began to reveal itself not in reports or tallies but in the faces of the men who had survived. Tom had flown through the Turkish chute, through the long-range strike that had reached farther than anyone thought possible, and through the desperate night return that had nearly claimed him. Now he stood with his hands resting on the railing, the salt air cool against his face, and allowed himself to feel what he had pushed aside while there was still work to be done. Around him the carrier was coming back to a kind of uneasy normal. Deck crews moved with the slow, deliberate pace of men who had not slept in days. The arresting wires had been checked and reset. The barriers had been cleared. Medical teams had treated the injured who had made it back and prepared the quiet spaces where those who had not would be remembered. In the ready rooms below, pilots who had flown the final mission sat in small groups or alone, some speaking in low voices about what they had seen, others simply staring at the floor as the adrenaline drained away. Tom had already been through the debriefing. He had reported his fuel state, the damage to his aircraft, and the moment when he had thought he might have to ditch. The words had come out flat and factual, the way they always did after a mission. Only now, in the quiet, did the rest of it begin to surface. He thought about the wingman who had flown beside him for most of the long strike and who had not returned. They had shared a quiet nod before launch that morning, the kind of wordless exchange that had become their habit over months of flying together. Tom had seen the other man's plane take hits during the attack on the Japanese carriers. He had stayed with him as long as he could, but the distance and the fuel had forced them apart in the darkness. Now there was only an empty spot in the formation where that plane should have been. Tom had written the man's name on a small piece of paper he kept in his pocket, along with the names of others who had been lost in the battle. He did not know what he would do with the list when the fighting finally ended. He only knew that carrying it felt like the least he could do. On the Japanese side, the remnants of the mobile fleet were moving slowly westward under the cover of darkness. The carriers that had survived the long-range strike were damaged and vulnerable, their flight decks scarred and their air groups reduced to a fraction of what they had been only days earlier. Aboard one of the surviving vessels, a young damage control officer named Sato moved through the lower decks with a flashlight, checking compartments for flooding and fires that still smoldered from the American attack. The ship listed slightly to one side, and the air smelled of smoke and oil. Sato had been on the bridge when the first bombs had fallen. He had seen the American planes diving through the flak, their wings catching the sunlight before the smoke obscured everything. He had felt the deck shudder and heard the screams of men caught in the explosions. Now he worked in the dim light, directing the remaining damage control teams and trying to keep the ship afloat long enough to reach safer waters. Sato thought about the friends who had been lost in the air battle the day before and the ones who had gone down with the carriers that had sunk during the American strike. He had written a letter to his family before the fleet had sortied, a letter that spoke of duty and the belief that Japan would prevail. He had not finished it. The paper was still in his locker, folded but incomplete. Now he wondered whether he would ever have the chance to finish it or whether the ship would be his final resting place. Around him other sailors worked with the same grim determination. Some had been at their posts since the first alarms had sounded days earlier. Others had been pulled from damage control parties only to be sent back when new leaks appeared. There was little talk. The work itself was the only language that still made sense. Back on the American carriers, the quiet conversations in the ready rooms gradually gave way to something closer to reflection. Pilots who had flown through the Turkey chute spoke in short sentences about the scale of the Japanese losses they had witnessed. One man described watching an enemy plane spiral into the sea and feeling not triumph but a sudden, sharp awareness that the man inside that aircraft had been doing exactly what he himself had been doing, following orders and trying to survive. Another pilot, younger than most, sat with his head in his hands and said nothing at all. An older hand placed a hand on his shoulder and left it there for a moment before moving on. These small gestures continued throughout the night. They were not dramatic. They were the ordinary ways men reminded one another that they were still human after everything they had seen and done. Tom eventually made his way below decks to the small space he shared with other pilots. He sat on the edge of his bunk and pulled out the letter he had been carrying. For a long time he simply held it, reading the words he had written days earlier when the battle had still felt like something that might be won cleanly. The letter spoke of duty and of the pride he felt in serving with the men around him. It did not mention the fear or the losses or the way the ocean had seemed to swallow so many lives without a trace. Tom folded the letter again and placed it back in his pocket. He would finish it later, when the words felt less inadequate. For now he lay down on the bunk and closed his eyes, though sleep did not come easily. The sounds of the ship around him, the steady thrum of the engines, the occasional footsteps in the passageway, were familiar, but they could not drown out the memories that kept surfacing. On the Japanese side, the situation aboard the damaged carriers was growing more desperate with every hour. Sato received reports from other compartments that flooding was increasing and that the list was becoming more pronounced. The ship's speed had dropped, and the escorting destroyers were struggling to maintain a protective screen. Sato moved from one crisis to the next, directing repairs and helping to move wounded men to safer areas. At one point he paused beside a young sailor who was sitting alone against the bulkhead, his face pale and his hands shaking. Sato offered the man a sip of water from his canteen and spoke quietly about the need to keep working. The words were simple, but they seemed to steady the younger man. He nodded once and pushed himself to his feet, following Sato back into the damaged compartments. These small moments of leadership and care continued even as the ship's condition worsened. They did not change the outcome, but they gave the men something to hold on to when everything else was slipping away. As the night deepened, the American task force maintained its position near Saipan. The invasion force ashore was still fighting to secure the island, and the carriers remained close enough to provide support if needed. On the decks, exhausted men found places to rest. Some slept in their bunks or in corners of the hangar decks. Others sat in small groups, sharing cigarettes or quiet stories. Tom eventually drifted into a restless sleep, only to wake a short time later with the image of his missing wingman's plane still clear in his mind. He sat up and rubbed his face, then reached for the small notebook he sometimes used to write when sleep would not come. He began to write about the battle, not for anyone else but for himself. He wrote about the long flight and the attack in the darkness that had nearly claimed him. He wrote about the lights that had appeared when all hope seemed gone and about the men who had not made it back. The words came slowly at first, then faster as the memories poured out. When he was finished, he closed the notebook and placed it under his pillow. The act of writing had not removed the weight, but it had made it feel a little more manageable. On the Japanese side, the damaged carriers continued their slow withdrawal. Sato had done everything he could to stabilize the flooding, but the ship was still taking on water and the list had become severe enough that walking required effort. The captain had ordered non-essential personnel to prepare to abandon ship if the situation worsened. Sato remained at his post, directing the remaining damage control efforts and checking on the wounded who could not be moved. He thought about the families waiting back in Japan and about the letters that would have to be written if he survived. He thought about the friends who had already been lost and about the ones who were still fighting beside him. In the dim light of the damaged compartments, these thoughts felt more real than the battle itself had ever seemed. The war had brought them all to this place, and now it was asking them to endure whatever came next. The quiet hours stretched on. On both sides, men who had fought with everything they had were now facing the aftermath in their own ways. Some found comfort in routine tasks, checking equipment, writing reports, helping a shipmate who needed it. Others sat in silence, letting the reality of what had happened wash over them. The battle had been won by the Americans in every strategic sense. The Marianas were secure. The path to Japan was open for the long-range bombers that would soon begin their campaigns. The Japanese naval air arm had been shattered beyond recovery. Yet in the quiet that followed the guns falling silent, those victories felt distant and abstract compared to the personal losses that could not be measured in ships sunk or islands taken. Tom woke again before dawn and made his way back to the flight deck. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, and the ocean stretched out in shades of gray. He stood in the same place he had stood the night before and looked out over the water. Somewhere to the west, the Japanese remnants were still moving. Somewhere below, the men who had been lost were still part of the sea. Tom thought about the letter in his pocket and the notebook under his pillow. He thought about the wingmen who would never read either. He thought about the Japanese pilots and sailors who had fought with the same courage and faced the same losses. The battle had changed the course of the war in the Pacific, but it had not changed the fundamental truth that every victory and every defeat was carried by ordinary men who had left homes and families behind to fight in a conflict that would shape the world long after they were gone. These are the kinds of personal stories and quiet realizations that deserve more than a single telling: the exhaustion that followed the fighting, the grief that settled in the silence, the small acts of humanity that reminded men they were still connected even when everything around them had been torn apart. Our Patreon community exists for exactly that kind of deeper exploration. There you can access free podcasts that go further into these events, raw and unblurred video sections that show the reality behind the summaries, and join a passionate group of fellow history lovers who want to sit with these stories the way they deserve to be remembered. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The carriers continued their slow movement through the water as the sun rose. The men who had survived the battle began to prepare for whatever came next, whether that meant flying again or simply carrying the memory of what they had endured. On the Japanese side, the damaged ships pressed on toward whatever safety might still be found. The cost had been paid on both sides in lives and in the quiet understanding that nothing would ever be the same. The guns had fallen silent, but the echoes of what had happened would remain with every man who had been there, shaping the way they saw the world long after the ocean had reclaimed the wreckage and the letters had been sent and the stories had begun to be told. In the quiet years after the guns had fallen silent across the Pacific, a man who had once climbed into a Hellcat cockpit over the Philippine Sea stood alone on a windswept beach and felt the same salt air that had carried him through nights of exhaustion and fear, remembering the friends whose planes had vanished into the darkness and the lessons that had been carved into his life by everything he had seen and survived. The battle itself had ended with the Japanese fleet in full retreat and the American task force holding its hard-won position near Saipan. Yet the true turning point revealed itself not in the final tally of ships sunk or planes destroyed but in the quiet realizations that settled over the men who had fought. On the American carriers, pilots like Tom gathered in ready rooms that now felt strangely empty. The names of those who had not returned were spoken in low voices during the long watches. Some men wrote letters home that tried to capture what could never be fully captured, the scale of the Japanese losses they had witnessed, the courage of the enemy pilots who had flown into certain destruction, and the private fear that had lived alongside every act of bravery. Tom sat at a small table with a notebook open before him and wrote about the long strike that had reached too far in the night when the lights had appeared like a miracle across the black water. He did not try to make the story heroic. He simply described the way the ocean had seemed to swallow so many lives and how the men who had come back carried the memory of those who had not. On the Japanese side, the survivors of the shattered mobile fleet faced a different kind of silence. The carriers that had once ruled the skies were gone or limping home with decks scarred by fire and empty of the aircraft that had once launched in such numbers. A young officer who had fought to save one of the damaged ships sat in a damaged cabin and looked at the photograph of his family he still carried in his pocket. He thought about the friends who had flown in the turkey shoot and never returned, about the pilots who had been rushed into combat with too little training and too much courage. He thought about the moment when the American strike had come from the clouds and the way the ship had shuddered under the impacts. The letter he had started before the battle remained unfinished in his locker. Now he wondered whether he would ever have the chance to complete it or whether the war would demand still more from him before it ended. The battle had broken Japan's ability to contest the skies of the Pacific in a way that could never be repaired. The experienced pilots who had once made the Imperial Navy's air arm a formidable force were gone, scattered across the ocean in the wreckage of their planes. New aircraft could be built in the factories back home, but the men who knew how to fly them with skill and judgment could not be replaced quickly. The loss was not measured only in numbers. It was measured in the quiet conversations that no longer happened in ready rooms, and the missing voices that had once guided younger pilots through their first carrier landings, and in the knowledge that had died with each man who had gone down. On the American side, the victory had come at a cost as well, though a lighter one. Pilots who had flown through the long hours of combat carried the memory of the men they had lost and the understanding that even overwhelming advantage did not remove the human price of war. Admiral Spruance remained on his flagship in the days that followed, reviewing reports and making the decisions that would shape the next phase of the campaign. He had chosen to protect the invasion force rather than pursue the retreating Japanese into the night, and that choice had preserved the larger objective even as it left some questions unanswered. In the quiet of his cabin, he thought about the young men who had flown and fought under his command, and about the families who would receive news of those who had not come home. He had carried the weight of those lives throughout the battle, and he would carry it long after the ships had returned to port. The decision had been his to make, and he accepted both the praise and the criticism that would follow. What mattered most to him was that the Marianas had been secured and that the path forward for the larger war effort remained open. Admiral Mitchell walked the decks of his flagship and spoke quietly with the pilots who had survived the long strike and the desperate night return. He had ordered the lights turned on when every instinct of a carrier commander warned against it, and that decision had brought many men home who would otherwise have been lost. He listened to their stories without interrupting, offering only the occasional word of acknowledgement. He knew that the courage they had shown in the air had been matched by the courage it took to speak of what they had seen when the fighting was over. Mitchell carried his own private reflections on the battle, the risks he had accepted, the lives that had been saved and the ones that had been lost, and the understanding that leadership in war was never as simple as choosing the boldest course. The lights had burned for a reason, and the men who had found their way home because of them would remember that reason long after the war had ended. On the Japanese side, the commanders who had led the mobile fleet into battle faced the grim reality of what had been lost. The plan for a decisive victory had collapsed under the weight of superior American radar, better aircraft, and more experienced pilots. The irreplaceable nature of trained aircrews had been proven in the most painful way possible. One senior officer sat alone in his cabin and read through the reports of losses that had come in from every carrier. He thought about the young pilots who had launched with determination and courage only to meet an enemy they could not overcome. He thought about the families back in Japan who would soon learn that their sons and husbands would not be coming home. The letter he had received from his own wife before the battle remained in his pocket, its words of encouragement now carrying a different weight. He folded it carefully and placed it back where he could reach it, a small anchor in a world that had shifted beneath his feet. The battle had opened the door to the final phase of the war in the Pacific. With the Marianas secured, American forces could now base the long-range bombers that would soon begin their campaigns against the Japanese home islands. The strategic bombing that would follow would bring the war directly to the enemy's cities and factories in ways that had never been possible before. The men who had fought in the Philippine Sea had not known the full shape of what would come next, but they had understood that the outcome of their battle would shape the path forward. On the American carriers, pilots who had once worried only about surviving the next mission began to speak in quiet moments about what the victory might mean for the families waiting back home and for the possibility that the war might someday end. On the Japanese side, the survivors of the shattered fleet understood that their nation's ability to defend itself from the air had been broken and that the road ahead would be one of increasing hardship and sacrifice. Tom eventually finished the letter he had been carrying. He wrote about the friends who had not returned and about the courage he had seen on both sides of the battle. He wrote about the night when the lights had appeared across the water and about the way the ocean had seemed both vast and terribly small at the same time. He did not try to explain the larger strategy or the reasons why the battle had turned out as it had. He simply described what he had seen and felt as a man who had been there. When he was finished, he folded the letter and placed it with the others he had written during the fighting. He did not know when they would reach home or whether the people who read them would understand everything he had tried to say. He only knew that writing them had helped him carry the weight of what he had experienced. Years later, when the war had ended and the world had begun to rebuild, the men who had fought in the Philippine Sea carried their memories in different ways. Some spoke of the battle only when asked directly, offering short accounts that left out the deepest emotions. Others wrote books or gave interviews in which they tried to explain what it had felt like to fly into danger or to watch friends disappear. A few returned to the Pacific and stood on beaches or looked out over the water, remembering the moments when everything had seemed lost and the moments when hope had appeared in unexpected forms. The lessons they carried were not always spoken aloud. They lived in the way these men led their families, in the quiet ways they honored the memory of those who had not come home, and in the understanding that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to keep going when fear was present. The battle had shown that technology and training mattered, but that the irreplaceable element in war remained the people who carried the knowledge and the courage. Japan had lost the core of its naval air arm in a way that could not be replaced, and that loss had shaped the final year of the conflict in ways no one could have fully predicted at the time. The United States had secured the bases that would allow the strategic bombing campaign to begin, and that campaign would bring the war to a conclusion that saved countless lives on both sides by making an invasion of the home islands unnecessary. The men who had fought understood these larger truths only in fragments. What they carried most clearly were the personal stories, the friend who had shared a cigarette before a mission, the officer who had turned on the lights when every rule said he should not, the Japanese pilot who had flown into certain death with the same determination as the men who shot him down. These are the kinds of personal stories and hidden layers of courage and sacrifice that often remain in the shadows of the larger narrative. If you want to explore more of these forgotten operations and the unsung individuals whose actions shaped the outcome of the war in ways that rarely appear in the history books, I invite you to sign up for our free email newsletter. You will receive the exclusive ebook The Shadow War, 5 top-secret operations that shaped World War II, along with weekly deep dives that bring those stories and the people behind them into clearer light. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The ocean that had carried both fleets across thousands of miles eventually reclaimed the wreckage of the battle. The ships that had sunk rested on the seabed, and the planes that had fallen disappeared into the depths. What remained were the stories carried by the men who had survived and the understanding that every turning point in history is written first in the lives of ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had changed the course of the war, but it had also changed the men who fought in it. They carried those changes home with them, and in the quiet years that followed they passed them on in the ways they lived and the ways they remembered. The legacies written in blood and steel were not only the strategic shifts that followed the battle. They were the personal transformations that happened in the hearts of the men who had been there, the quiet courage that endured long after the guns had fallen silent, and the human connections that survived even when everything else had been torn apart. Those legacies remain with us still, reminders that history is not only about the movements of fleets and the outcomes of campaigns, but about the ordinary men who carried the weight of those movements and outcomes in their own lives and passed the lessons forward so that others might understand what it truly means to fight and to endure.